Good afternoon. On behalf of both Program Council and myself, I'd like to formally welcome you all to today's program. My name is Jared Evans, and today I have the distinct honor and privilege to introduce to you the world's most famous criminal profiler, Robert Ressler. Robert Ressler is a criminologist in private practice and the director of Forensic Behavioral Services, a Virginia-based company-based organization dedicated to training, lecturing, consultation, and expert witness testimony. Mr. Ressler is an expert in the area of violent criminal offenders, particularly in the area of serial and sexual homicide. He is a specialist in the area of criminology, criminal personality profiling, crime scene analysis, homicide, sexual assaults, threat assessment, workplace violence, and hostage negotiation. He is a 20-year veteran of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, serving 16 years in the FBI's Behavioral Science Unit as a supervisory special agent and criminologist, retiring in 1990. He innovated many of the programs which led to the formulation of the FBI's National Center for the Analysis of Violent Crime. Mr. Ressler became the first program manager of the FBI's Violent Criminal Apprehension Program, or VICAP, in 1985. His academic affiliations have been as an instructor of criminology while at the FBI Academy, adjunct faculty at the University of Virginia, research fellow at the University of Pennsylvania, adjunct assistant professor at Michigan State University School of Criminal Justice, and he is a clinical assistant professor in psychiatry in Georgetown University's program in psychiatry and law. He is a visiting instructor with the Department of Forensic Science or Forensic Pathology at Dundee University in Dundee, Scotland. He originated and directed the FBI's first research program on violent criminal offenders, interviewing and collecting data on 36 serial and sexual killers, resulting in 2 books, Sexual Homicide, Patterns and Motives in 1988, and the Crime Classification Manual in 1992 by Lexington Press. He also co-authored his autobiography, Whoever Fights Monsters, in 1992, as well as Justice is Served in 1994, and I Have Lived in the Monster, his latest book, just recently come out, all by St. Martin Press. Mr. Ressler's books and real-life experiences have been the inspiration for many books authored by Mary Higgins Clark and other authors of the films The Red Dragon, Silence of the Lambs, Copycat, and The X-Files. Mr. Ressler has served with the U.S. Army, 10 years of which were active duty during the Vietnam era. He served in the military police and as a criminal investigative officer with the Army CID Command Headquarters in Washington. He retired at the rank of colonel with 35 years of service. Now, before we begin our program, I'd like to mention 2 things. We'd like to thank the College of Criminal Justice for providing for the reception that will follow this program at 6 o'clock in the Criminal Justice Center lobby, as well as around 3:30 we're going to open it up for questions, and at the end of the program we'll also open it up for questions. So if you do have a question, there's going to be mics on the left and right-hand side of the auditorium, so if you'd make your way to those before you ask your question. And without further ado, I give you Mr. Robert Ressler.
Thank you very much. I'm pleased to be here once again, and I have been here before in years past, although not for quite a few years, but I worked down here with Dr. Moore on the Violent Criminal Apprehension Program. I'm sure some of you have heard of that. Possibly have to have memorized various portions of it and spit it back to him and test, whatever. But I have been here before, and I've always enjoyed coming back to Huntsville. It's a great program you've got going here, great staff, faculty, and students as well. What I'd like to do this afternoon is just kind of open up the door. Dr. Moore had more or less indicated that many people were interested in some of the current programs of the FBI, criminal profiling, crime scene analysis, the work that has been ongoing over a period of many years and is now spreading far beyond the FBI's ranks. I was one of the early individuals down at the FBI Academy back in the early 70s when, in fact, a lot of this took place. And we kind of hammered out many of the programs that you see now almost on a routine basis. The Violent Criminal Apprehension Program, which I had indicated, really had its birth right here at Sam Houston State University. The task force that was brought together here. We had some 30-plus people involved in this brainstorming session to bring together a computerized system of bringing together the various dynamics of violent crime, unsolved homicide, and today that program is now ongoing, has been alive and well since about the 1980s. I plan on mentioning it later, but I'll mention it right now, just to show the way the evolution of things occur and the way these things escalate. Back in 1980, the early 80s, we started with this VICAP task force, which met here and in Washington, D.C. The idea to put some sort of a rein on the violent crime, the serial and multiple homicides that were going on in the country, to give the police a tool to deal with homicides of a like type that possibly were connected across the country. Henry Lee Lucas, back at that particular time, had surfaced, and the media had blown that thing way out of proportion, where Henry Lee was responsible for hundreds and hundreds of homicides, which never was true. But the fact is, it did bring attention to the fact that law enforcement needed help in working such cases. Henry Lee, I think, is a resident not too far from here. I don't know quite where he is right now. Some of you may, but I paid a visit to him a while back and got some insights from him as well. But as I say, the way these things escalate and build, and you're really on the ground floor of many of the things that are ongoing right now. VICAP, Violent Criminal Apprehension Program, began as a lengthy form, really three forms that brought together all aspects of a unsolved homicide. Eventually, it was trimmed down to one form, and has been used now, as I say, for many years by the FBI, who disseminated throughout the police field and maintained their data bank back in Washington, D.C. At the FBI Academy, where I worked for 16 years, we started a police fellowship program, and that police fellowship program brought in police officers from around the country that attended the Academy for a one-year fellowship to study the criminal profiling program, the VICAP system, and all that was going on at the Academy. A number of foreign officers also attended that program from Canada, from the Netherlands, from Australia, different locations in the world. And in fact, the Canadian officers, during the time that they were at the FBI Academy, took a great interest in VICAP, and they then took that information back to Canada. They developed they built off of the VICAP system what they call VICLASS, the Violent Crime Linkage and Analysis System, which in fact was a two-language, being Canada, French and English, a two-language system, and it actually expanded the VICAP program to areas of rape, child molestation, and other such areas. They actually improved on the VICAP system, now calling it VICLASS. VICLASS was passed on to Australia. Australia is now using the VICLASS system routinely. It's being used in the Netherlands. The last I heard, Scotland Yard had a project going of testing out the system with 200 various homicides that they were putting into the system to test it out, and they were planning of adopting it throughout the UK. I personally brought the system to Poland about a year and a half ago and set up a possibility for the Poles to adopt that system within their own country. The possibility now, and of course, Dr. Moore and I worked on this back in the early '80s when it was just an idea of a career police officer named Pierce Brooks, who retired from the Los Angeles Police Department back in, I believe it was the '50s. But the system now has escalated to the point where it is being used internationally, and the real potential here, and there's a great interest. I've also worked with it with the authorities of the Ministry of the Interior of the country of Austria, the Republic of Austria, who also have adapted this system, and they are very interested and instrumental in getting this system going throughout the European community, the new European community, and in fact to organize this possibly through Interpol, where it will be an international sharing program of information on violent offenders on an international level. Austria got interested because several years ago they had a case where a serial killer was operating in the country of Austria. One of the murders were in Switzerland. One was in, I believe, the Czech Republic. And there was one actually in Los Angeles, and they did bring in people from the FBI's VICAP program to assist them in doing a VICAP analysis, which in fact came together, and an individual by the name of Jack Unterweger turned out to be the killer, was prosecuted in Austria, actually hung himself right at the time of sentencing. But the fact is that was the first case made on an international VICAP-type analysis that brought together information from several countries to include the United States across the ocean, bringing together information to prosecute this man in the Austrian courts. So you can see the way all the escalation of technology has gone on in this particular area. And believe me, in the criminal justice field, it is sheer excitement on a day-to-day basis now in the past years to see the way technology is moving along and opening all sorts of new doors for fighting violent crime. Many of yourselves are sitting here listening to me. Believe me, I sat where you were sitting listening to others back when I was I was in the military at the time. I was sitting in Chicago at the Chicago Police Auditorium, Chicago Police Department, listening to 3 FBI agents talking about the NCIC system, National Crime Information System, talking about this computerized system that would bring together information on an instantaneous basis on running car plates, license numbers, monetary serial numbers, etc., gun serial numbers, and you'd get it back all within 2 or 3 minutes. We sat there and said, bull, you know, these FBI guys, who believes them, you know? And what are they trying to sell us? You're going to have a system where you can actually get a serial number checked out and get a make on it within 2 or 3 minutes? Forget it. Today, NCIC, of course, is an integral part of the law enforcement arsenal against violent crime. And that was really just one of the first big ones. All sorts of things are on the horizon. I'll talk about some today in some of the cases I've worked on. Forensic development is just literally running away with itself, and it makes the job easier for us in law enforcement. It makes it tougher for those that think that they can break the law in the sense of, especially in the sense of violent crimes. So that's kind of what I want to cover today, just kind of an overview of my career. I know when you're sitting, again, where you're sitting, you're thinking about the future. What am I going to do? Where am I going to go? What's available to me? You know, somebody may be sitting out here saying, I'm an art major. I'm strictly into art. I'm very interested in law enforcement, but where's a place for me? I'll show you a place for you in the area of forensic sculpting. I have a case that I'll show you today where a case was literally solved, a 17-year-old case that couldn't be solved by anybody who had worked on the case, including myself, who did psychological profiles. It was solved by an artist who did a clay bust of enhancing the age of an individual some 20-some years, putting that on America's Most Wanted, and catching the individual just like that. That technique has been used from time to time in the past, and is being used more and more. I belong to the American Academy of Forensic Sciences, and on an annual basis I see forensic sculpting and art in recreating, you know, age enhancements of children who are missing, that sort of thing, developing even further and becoming a very, again, important part of the overall criminal justice arsenal. I was in South Africa about a year and a half ago, and over in South Africa, working on a serial murder case in South Africa where over 40 women were killed. I went into the South African police laboratory and got a guided tour, and into the one area I saw they had a forensic artist, a sculptor working on their staff, and he was recreating the facial features from the skulls that were found of some of these victims, but also he was studying on doing the sculpting from photographs and doing age enhancements, and he had cited the work of Frank Bender that I had worked with and that did the original work for the FBI. So you can see internationally now the world's getting smaller. Sharing is going on at a unbelievable level, and as I say, it's getting very, very difficult for criminals to do what they do and get away with it with the increase in technology. And of course, people like yourselves who are getting into this field and who want to actively and aggressively participate. So let's take a look at the overall picture here today, and I'll offer this quote to you by Friedrich Nietzsche, which is a quote that I kind of glommed onto here a number of years ago. And it is very significant to me because, as you heard in my introduction, I have done a great deal of work in the area of serial crime, multiple homicide, sexual offenders, violent sexual offenders. Friedrich Nietzsche offered these words of wisdom many, many years ago, and in saying that whoever fights monsters should see to it that they, in the process, they do not become a monster. I think that's a caution that I only began to understand once I would really get into the research and dealing with the violent offenders from the standpoint that I think all of us have a perception of a violent offender, a serial killer, as being some sort of a knuckle-dragging Neanderthal. If you saw the film Silence of the Lambs, you know the concept of Hannibal Lecter, this diabolical man who stands behind a plexiglass shield in a penitentiary and exchanges information with Jodie Foster. This really spooky guy. And if this is what you're looking for, you're going to be sadly disappointed when you come across an individual that really is a serial killer. And I will show you some today, and I'll show you some videotape of these individuals. And I think you'll see that they come across as more ordinary than you'd believe. This business of being behind a plexiglass shield, Jodie Foster. How many saw the film Silence of the Lambs? How many didn't see the film Silence of the Lambs? Okay, that's better. The thing was blown way out of proportion as to the realities of this business, and Jodie Foster, of course, is interviewing Hannibal Lecter behind his plexiglass shield. I've been in more prisons than Al Capone or any other criminal, I think, in the country. I have never seen a plexiglass shield in a penitentiary. Jodie Foster has this interesting exchange with Hannibal, and of course he comes across as a very eerie, spooky guy. But in reality, most of these serial and multiple offenders are very, very nice people. And I've often said that they're some of the nicest, most interesting conversationalists that I've ever encountered. So what does that make me? Some sort of a Looney Tunes or what? In reality, the fact is they're nice people, but they're nice people behind bars and in custody. On the street, they're obviously very, very dangerous people. But the fact is most of your violent offenders have mastered the art of victim science, if you will, or victimology, to the point where they become very effective in sizing up their victims, setting up their victims, and really capturing their victims at the proper time and place without ever even producing a weapon for the most part. Right now in Spotsylvania, Virginia, where I live in Spotsylvania near Fredericksburg, we have 3 young women, actually young girls, 12, 14, 15 years of age, that have been abducted over the past year, very mysteriously. And when I talk about this smooth, glib, kind of manipulative type of individual, which I believe is involved in this case, these young ladies were at their homes, on their front porches, in broad daylight, after school, and like they disappeared into thin air, with neighbors around and everything else, they're just gone. And how does an individual get into a residential neighborhood, a fairly nice neighborhood, and take a young lady like this from her home without creating any kind of havoc, any kind of fighting or anything of that nature, and just totally disappear? And that's the type of offender that you'll find most of these people are. They develop such a ability to manipulate and control their victims that oftentimes they defy belief in the way that they can get their victims. They usually do it by con and by skillful manipulation. The second part of the quote there is that when you look into an abyss, the abyss also looks back. And I began to find out what this means as well. The part about, don't become a monster if you're dealing with them, as I say, what I'm saying here is that you'll find them so ordinary that you have to guard yourself not to fall into the traps that these people have fallen into in their growing up into their adult lives, and that is victimizing other human beings based on just personal whim. Sexual monetary. In other words, at a very early age, they begin to treat people like objects rather than like another human being. And once you lose your feeling of another person as being a human being, you've lost a certain amount of your humanity. If you're dealing with people like this on a routine basis, and even police officers on the street, dealing with one of the biggest traps of a young police officer is within the first several years on the street, they begin looking at the citizen as some sort of a jerk. It's them and us the cops, them the jerks. And they start writing everybody off as irresponsible, lawbreakers, traffic violators. And I think this is what Nietzsche refers to in a sense. They begin becoming what they are trying to protect society against. They start looking at everybody as being criminal or lawbreakers. And that's really not the way to deal in law enforcement. When you look into the abyss looks back, and I'll show you some of the cases, some of the interviews I've talked to people in penitentiary sitting one-on-one across from many, many violent offenders. And when you look deep into the crevice of their mind, that abyss, if you will, you'll find that you're looking basically, again, at your own reflection. These people are not that different from us in the beginning of their lives. And as they develop on through their life, they fall deeper and deeper into aberrant behavior. But essentially, many of their qualities are the same as you. And I'll tell you about some of these offenders. The fact is that these people have gone way off on a tilt. And of course, it's a good lesson to stay human, to look at people as human beings, not to take that attitude that even the worst violent criminal or the worst individual I have ever dealt with, either in an arrest situation, investigation arrest, or just interview, I've always treated them as I would, say, a bank president interviewing a president in a bank. You have to treat people with regard, with trust, with respect, or you'll never get information. And of course, the basis of my research was getting information from violent offenders. Whoa, I don't know what's that. This is one of my college professors here. No, this is an individual. I don't think he belongs quite right where he is here. Seem to be having a little problem with my control unit here. Let's just pass him for the time being and take a look at the FBI Academy at Quantico, Virginia. This is where I spent 16 years. It is quite a facility. It's probably comparable in many respects to the school you're going to right here. It is really a small college of sort. It is a academy that brings in together FBI people from throughout the United States for training, for basic training, and then on eventually into in-service training later in their careers. It also brings together law enforcement officers from throughout the country in their FBI National Academy program. And I worked here for 16 years in the kind of the depths of the academy. Here you have the dining hall, and down deep below the dining hall, several levels down, is the FBI Behavioral Science Unit. And that's where I worked for 16 years. If you saw the film Silence of the Lambs, and I think we've qualified, most have, when Jodie Foster gets into the elevator with all the big guys with the red shirts and the tan pants, and the elevator goes down, that is in that particular building right there, which is the dining hall building, the gun vault, and then below is the Behavioral Science Unit. I went there as an instructor. I went there as a criminologist, and over the years I developed some programs the FBI is still using today in concert with my colleagues. The criminal personality profiling program, the violent criminal apprehension unit, were not part of the FBI when I joined it. These became part of the FBI structure. And myself and my colleagues really worked on this stuff to the extent that oftentimes there was personal risk. Believe me, back in the 1970s, when you were delving into the area of behavioral science and trying to interject that into law enforcement, there were people at the top of the FBI that were a little bit suspicious about this sort of thing. We were looked at as a bunch of renegades, rebels. I was called a social worker on one occasion. by a very high-up assistant director in the FBI, and he had indicated, when I had proposed going into prisons and doing research into penitentiaries, talking to violent offenders, he said, "Mr. Ressler," he said, "do you want to be a social worker or do you want to be an FBI agent?" And I said, "Well, I joined the Bureau to be an FBI." And he said, "Well, it sounds to me like what you're talking about is social work, and you might be looking for another job one of these days." I thought, "Uh-oh, my career is coming to an abrupt halt here." But that individual soon retired, and the next individual coming in found great value in what we were proposing, and from there on it went uphill. The first project that really got some attention for our unit was what was known as the serial killer study, or first it was called the Criminal Personality Research Project, became to be known as the Serial Killer Project, and eventually the research that I was proposing was approved, and I did start going into penitentiaries throughout the country, 20 different state prisons throughout the country, to include here in Texas, and interviewing some 36 different violent offenders, many of which you'll see in today's presentation. People who had the worst of the worst, you might say. And as you can see, where it says that 7 had killed one individual, that means they had been convicted of one killing, when in fact all had killed multiply. So actually all 36 had killed multiply, only 7 were convicted of killing one when they had killed more. A total of 118 victims bona fide, but we suspected more like 200 to 250 victims had fallen to this group of 36. So when you're talking about a group, a small group, and of course this is a small sample, a small survey, at the same time it is necessarily small because of the nature of what you're studying. I had a trial one time I was testifying in, and they had an expert on the other side, and he said, "Well, look," he said, this study basically, which led to the publication of the book Sexual Homicide Patterns and Motives, only looked at 36 individuals. The sample was 36, and that's too small of a sampling. In any decent, study in sociology, you should have 5,000 or 10,000, suspects to look, individuals to look at for your research to get a better picture of what's going on. I thought, well, I'll tell you, if I find 10,000 serial killers, I'm going to seek residence in another country, believe me. So I was just as glad, and believe me, it is hard to get into a prison to find these people, but once you find them, it yields a great deal of reward. Mass murder became kind of an interest somewhere around the mid to late 60s. We started thinking about mass murder in this country, and mass murder, this is the Chicago St. Valentine's Day Massacre, where really I think this brought, in the early part of this century, this crime was brought to the attention of the public mainly by, first of all, it happened in Chicago, and then after that, of course, movies were made about it, Robert Stack and, the Untouchables and that sort of thing. Many movies had portrayed the St. Valentine's Day Massacre, which was one of the early mass murders of public, that brought to public interest. In reality, by today's standard, this is a not really what we look at as a mass murder of the type that we see today. It's what I would call a murder of criminal enterprise. A classification here of criminal enterprise or criminal competition. What you had was one organized crime gang. A rival gang wanted to get rid of their competitors, so they donned police uniforms, walked into a warehouse where all these characters were, playing cards, drinking, whatever, and the police officers, as they would seem, came in with Thompson submachine guns, which were really quite, oftentimes used in the Roaring Twenties and thereabouts, and rounded up these individuals who were kind of chuckling. They figured they'd get their attorneys, they'd be released before the end of the day. But when they saw these guys racking the rounds into the Thompsons and starting to crank off, 45 caliber slugs, they realized that something was amiss here. Either the Chicago Police Department had gone totally nuts, or these guys weren't cops. And of course, that was it. They were not police officers. They were criminals that were wiping out a gang. It was an act of mass murder, all in one location, all at one time. But in this case, for competition, criminal competition, as a result of a criminal enterprise, that being criminal activity, bringing in money. The crime classification manual is another project I worked on, and some of you may, I think, have copies of that. This would be certainly a crime of enterprise, where the type of mass murder that we've seen most recently is now of the variety of what we categorize as personal cause type homicides. And these were people that are really going off the deep end, no enterprise involved. Right here in Texas, you had Luby's Cafeteria. George Hennard went in for a hamburger and killed an awful lot of people in the process. Rather than parking in the parking lot, he parked right through the window of the restaurant in Killeen, Texas, and took a lot of lives. And James Huberty out in California, San Ysidro, California, walks into McDonald's back in the 80s and opens up with semi-automatic weapons, killing almost 30 people. These types of mass murder events are now occurring, and they're becoming really more perplexing, because with the criminal competition type, at least you can see a reasonable motive. Now you're getting that personal cause, mental derangement, individuals that cannot stand under the stresses of their life and in fact turn to mass murder as a way out. Mass murder of the 70s, 60s and 70s is now given way in the 80s and 90s to what we call workplace violence. And the situation now is where mentally unsound people are going into the workplace. And when I say the workplace, I'm not eliminating universities. There are many, many incidents of mass murder occurring throughout the country on college campuses. One of the worst was up in Canada. Mark Lapine was a student in a university up in Canada. He was an aspiring engineering student who wanted to get into an engineering school. He was denied that access. He began more or less in a depressed state, thinking about the reasons he couldn't get into the engineering school. He'd noted there were a lot of female students, and like George Hennard, who was very much of a anti-feminist type individual in Texas who hated women, Mark Lapine theorized and figured out that if these women were not getting these positions in these spots in the engineering school, he would have been accepted, and he decided to kill a lot of women. He went into a classroom of male and female engineering students in the engineering building on the campus, took a semi-automatic weapon in there with him, told the males to exit, and killed, I think, 16, 17 young women in that classroom on that particular day. So you're seeing this mass murder is now giving way to all sorts of weird twists, to include family homicide. There are now many, many cases of family homicide where entire families are being wiped out by deranged people. But mass murder, of course, is all in one place, all at one time, a lot different than serial killing. Another one of my college professors, former professors, Charles Manson was one of my first teachers, you might say. And these professors of mine are a little bit different, I hope, than yours. But I've learned from people like Manson. The first guy was with the weird clothes on was Robert Berdella. I didn't want to talk about him at the time, but he killed 7 young men in Kansas City, Missouri, the guy with the fancy silk outfits on there. And he was a serial killer. Manson, everybody would look at Manson as being one of the most dangerous people in this country, and by today's standard, we're back in the 60s when Manson's crimes occurred in the late 60s. The world thought Manson was really a boogeyman. By today's standards, he's a pussycat, believe me. His crimes do not measure anywhere near the crimes of John Wayne Gacy, who killed 33, that we know of, I might add. Jeffrey Dahmer in Milwaukee, who killed 17. And on, as Ted Bundy in Florida, executed in Florida, who they think may have killed as many as 100. Estimates between 35 and 100. Manson basically was a con man, a con artist, an individual who lived by his wits, not too witty, though, because he's still in jail. He's been in jail for the great majority of his 60 years. He's been in jail now, I think, for about 40-some. So the man is a clever, articulate, bright guy, but he converted his entire life to just doing misdeeds. Essentially, Manson's crimes were, as I say, looked at with awe by the country because it was the first time that we saw, back in 1968-69, we saw the event of celebrities being killed by some sort of a cult leader. And of course, cults have gone every which way since that time as well, where Manson had developed this band of, really a lot of them were college dropouts, some were college graduates, a lot of young, bright people that should have known better, but Manson led them to some very, very bizarre and murderous behavior. And Manson never really pulled the trigger. He just orchestrated these things to come together, and a lot of people died as a result. But since that time, we've seen all sorts of cults taking place. We've seen things occurring where people are following false prophets. Most recently, I was in Japan for the sarin gas attack business that occurred with the Shirinko cult, led by a blind guy by the name of Shoko Asahara, who led literally thousands of people, had $1 billion industry going, and converted that to an all-out war against the government of Japan, which he intended to take over. Manson believed that one day he would become king of America. When the race war started, the blacks and whites fought each other in the ashes. Manson would preach to his followers that he would emerge from all this rubble as a president, or the king of America, he called himself. Asahara thought he could take over the Japanese government. And you sit back there and you say, what kind of people, what kind of people follow jerks like this? I mean, where do they get their power? Believe me, it's very frightening when you see what something like this can produce. Manson had these young college kids, basically non-criminal people. None of them were criminals. They were young, like I say, many of them college age, many of them college students, some college dropouts, some college graduates. And this is the handiwork that they would produce, carving war in the stomach of one of their victims, Lino LaBianca, to declare war against society after the murders that Manson had engineered. And you look around, look at your neighbors, look at the person sitting next to you, but how about the person in the dorm with you? Do you think a person that you know could do something like this? The answer is that all of these people were normal young kids until Manson got a hold of them. Very, very influential person. This is Jim Jones. Jim Jones, who took almost 1,000 people to Guyana and carved out a little patch out of the jungle called the Jonestown and established his own particular variety of cult. When Congressman Leo Ryan here came to investigate the circumstances in Guyana, Jim Jones became his paranoia, and basically he was a paranoid personality. His paranoia went right through the roof, and he set on the congressional inquiry, the news photographers with firearms, killing a lot of people, and then forcing 913 people, forcing them to their deaths by drinking poison Kool-Aid, and many of them drank it willingly to go with Jim Jones to the happy hunting ground. And again, where do you get people that want to do something like this? Father Jones, give me that Kool-Aid. I want to, Most recently, you had Hale Bopp. He had 30-some people that hopped the comet to fly with their leader off behind this comet. Where do people get this kind of power over others? But these events of mass murder, of course, are cult-oriented. Now, cults, of course, how much do we see them today? How about David Koresh in Waco, Texas? Not all that far from here. Koresh, again, was an individual who had people believing he had the powers of Jesus Christ. Manson used to call himself Jesus Christ. And, of course, the Waco situation ended up in ashes as well, with the bizarre teachings of David Koresh and really with the federal government going a little bit berserk on their own. I began back in the 70s first interested in mass murder, events of mass murder, and because at that time that's what we were seeing more of, the mass events. I got to interview Richard Speck in prison, and Richard Speck, if you recall, was an individual in Chicago back in the 60s who, again, I think was probably the first case that really brought certainly the country to the attention of an individual like this. Really, it preceded Manson by a few years, but in this case, Speck killed 8 young women in one night in Chicago during an evening of just mayhem. He was a character who was really a bum. He was a wanted fugitive out of Texas. He was up in Chicago without a job. He was trying to secure a position on a merchant seaman ship down in New Orleans. He wanted to get down to New Orleans. He needed some money. So he tried to rob a townhouse which was occupied by young student nurses. All of these were student nurses attending University of Illinois, I believe, its Circle campus. I think the nursing school up there. And in fact, Speck had broken into their townhouse. Several of them were in there. He tied them up. Started looking for money, and a couple more came back from night classes. He tied them up and started looking around again for money, and then a few more came back from dates, and now he had the nurses tying each other up. He'd torn up bed sheets and had the young women tying each other up because it was too much for him to do. 3 of these young ladies were Filipinos. One is absent from the picture here because she's alive today, lived to testify against Speck. But the fact is that Speck, in one event of an episode of murder, had taken the lives of 8 young women, thought he was killing 9. One rolled under a bed. Speck was under drugs and alcohol that night and lost count, and so one did survive. But the Filipino nurse that survived stated that the 2 of her colleagues here, 2 of the young ladies being Filipino, but the one that survived said that the Filipino girls had suggested to the other girls that maybe we ought to fight this guy when he went downstairs to get another victim, to let another girl in. We ought to fight him. We ought to, fight him as best as we can, hit him with things, open windows, scream. They're on the 2nd level. And the native, the American Caucasian ladies here said, no, this is Chicago. You don't understand this country. Just do what he says, listen to whatever he says, and we'll be okay. Well, that wasn't very good information. Fighting this guy would have been the way to go. Because later, when I interviewed him, he told me specifically the reason he killed these young women was for one particular reason, and that was just to eliminate witnesses. He was there to rob them. Sexual assault was played up by the paper, but really was not that prominent. He murdered all of these young women merely to prevent witnesses. I asked him, I said, Richard, if they all started screaming and hollering, throwing things out of the window when you were downstairs, what would you have done? And he said, I'd gotten the hell out of there. He said, I probably would have just bolted out the door and ran. He said, because obviously it's going to bring somebody, it would have brought somebody to my attention. So I've heard that over and over again in prisons. Fighting and resisting is far better than giving in and following the orders of an offender like this. They take advantage of people that are willing to obey. This case, again, occurred all back there in the 60s on into the early 70s. This one was about the same time as the Manson murders. And historically speaking, again, was a very significant case. Again, something that occurred not too far from here. This is Charles Whitman of the Texas Tower. And again, showing a case where a student, what was considered to be an ordinary student, went off the deep end. And we studied this crime. We had all the information from it. Couldn't study Whitman because he was killed up on the tower. But this guy went up on top of the tower merely to take as many people with him as he possibly could in an event of just mass homicide. He went up on the Texas Tower, the landmark on the University of Texas there at Austin, and started shooting his weapons, and he took a lot of weapons up there with him. You can see the vantage point. He took a lot of weapons up there with him. He took all those weapons with him because he knew that he wanted to kill as many people as possible, and he wanted to die on that tower. This is actually an act of suicide. It's not really even, it's basically motivated as a suicide, but this man was very hostile. He was very aggressive. He had killed his wife the night before. He killed his mother the night before. He hated his father, and yet he killed his mother and his wife, who he loved, because he was going to leave his father behind to pay for what he considered to be the father's sins. Then went the next day up in the tower, and in fact took the lives of, some 16, 17 people, wounding again twice that many, and all another event of mass murder. So you can see the origins of this. Really, prior to the mid-'60s, we heard very little of this type of behavior in this country, this mass murder in public places. And it's escalated and it's gone beyond just these motiveless types to the actually getting into the workplace, on the college campus, in the courtrooms. Here in Tarrant County, I think a while back, you had a case where a guy burst into a courtroom and shot up a bunch of attorneys and judges. I think he killed a judge. Did he not, Doug? Kill a judge, I think? Courtrooms, in law offices. What has surprised me, I shouldn't even say this, but what has surprised me is that this has not taken place against the Internal Revenue Service. Because recently, with all the disclosures about what the IRS has been up to, I'm just amazed that that people haven't really gone after the IRS. But believe me, the IRS is nervous about that, and I have heard that they have actually had more or less prevention programs to prevent people from getting too angry. And of course, the Oklahoma bombing, Tim McVeigh, Terry Nichols. You're seeing tremendous acts now of multiple mass homicide in this country. All this is very new. From where you sit, and this is Charles Whitman, the only way he was going down off that tower was feet first, and he knew it. And two individuals, a Texas Ranger and a civilian, went up and actually put their life at risk to get him off the tower, and they did shoot him and bring him down. But, like I say, the fact here is that this, from where you sit, this is all commonplace. You've grown up with a lot of this. Believe me, prior to the mid-'60s, really, this sort of thing just didn't happen to any degree, and now it's so commonplace. And of course, serial murder even more so. Serial murder is becoming so commonplace it's on the news every night, and when you get off the news onto some sort of a movie or some sort of a series, it's part of the evening's entertainment. Here's an individual named John List, and this is one I already told you about where forensic sculpturing came into play with this individual, bringing him to justice after 17 years of being a fugitive. He was a businessman. I worked on this case in the FBI in the early to mid-'70s, where I constructed profiles which I thought were pretty good, and I thought for sure that it might help in getting this guy. It never did. I'd love to stand up here and say my profile caught John List. I'd be lying through my teeth. The profiles, I think, were accurate. In fact, I know they were accurate because later when we caught the guy, it proved to be accurate, but was useless from the standpoint of capturing him. What captured him was a forensic advance of forensic sculpturing. List was a businessman. He lived in Westfield, New Jersey. He was an individual who had a crime-free life. He'd been an Army officer. He had a family, several kids, boy, girl. Had his mother-in-law living with him, and was a insurance broker, insurance man. Had a pretty good income, but went over the deep end. Like most family homicides you'll see, these family mass murder events, mental illness was at play. Most of the people that get involved in this sort of thing are suffering from paranoia. The mass murderers suffer from paranoia, from depressed, various forms of psychotic or borderline psychotic depression. And they're very identifiable. They're very preventable if, in fact, somebody observes and recognizes the problems. List eventually began believing that he could not get out from under his financial burdens, and felt that his life and his family, his life, his family's life was going to suffer, and decided the only thing he could do was to kill them all on All Saints' Day, send them to heaven, kill himself, join them, and that would get away from this terrible world. So one at a time, as his wife came home from shopping, shot her in the head. As his kids came home from school, shot them, shot the mother-in-law upstairs, put them all down on the floor in this dining area, and in fact covered them up with sleeping bags, wrote notes to his minister and paid off some bills, put the 45 on the table, said, now it's my turn to join my family. Put the gun up there, and he said, wait a minute, it was really a burden with all these people, feeding all these people, keeping everything going, but my life is a lot simpler now. I think I can make it, think I can do it on my own, and bingo, he disappears for 17 years, gets remarried, starts a new life, kind of cured himself through his actions here. No longer suicidal. Well, as I say, the profiles didn't do any good at all, but what did do good was this three-dimensional clay bust. And as I said, if there are any art students in the class or in the group here wondering how you can fit into the forensic field or into the law enforcement effort, a whole new era of forensic application here is coming in through art. The FBI for years has used drawings to, for example, take a fugitive and put on a beard, take off a mustache, bring the hairline back, do whatever to create different pictures of what that guy might look like. And most recently, they've been using now the age enhancement, computerized age enhancement, by taking a missing child of 6 years of age and show what she'll look like at 12. The National Center for Missing and Exploited Children hired a retired FBI agent who went up and headed that section of computer enhancement and drawing to play with people's features to give police an idea what they may look like. But in this case, you had a 40-plus-year-old man. You had really no recent photographs of him, so Mr. Bender had to attach 17 to 20 years of that man through the vehicle, the medium of clay, and in a three-dimensional fashion actually receded the hairline somewhat, kind of sagged the face a little bit, and just turned this 42-year-old man into somebody around 60. And that bust was then showed, displayed on the television show America's Most Wanted, hosted by John Walsh. I've worked with John Walsh a number of years, and John really thought this was a great thing to do. It kicked off. It was displayed on television. Within, after 17 years of unsuccessful investigation, John List was caught just a few weeks later. You can see the very close resemblance between the clay bust and the man who called himself Robert Clark in Richmond, Virginia, who was caught, denied being John List, said he was Bob Clark. They fingerprinted him, and in fact, it was John List. A neighbor turned him in, said, "I saw it in America's Most Wanted. The guy down the street looks like that man." Of course, you can see the age enhancement here and how accurate that was. Really upset me when I found out they caught this guy in Richmond. I used to go down to Richmond every week for my reserve meeting. Son of a gun, if I nailed this guy, I could have called my cards into the bureau and got myself an assignment down in, maybe down in Santa Fe has been one of my fantasies of where I'd like to live sometime, but didn't work. I never saw him. If I did, I didn't recognize him, and that was too bad. Here you have Frank Bender, the artist, who's in the process of putting this thing together. Here's Mr. List kind of giving Frank a bad look there. And I've gone with Frank. I've gone to Australia with Frank. I've gone to England, to different places in the world, and Frank attends conferences and shares this talent with other artists. Now, in years past, forensic artists always took skulls of human beings, as Frank has done, and taking a skull, somebody you don't know who it is, and building up the facial features. They put little plugs on the face to build up the skin level at a certain height. He studied anatomy. He's done this many times. It's easy for a sculptor when, in fact, they have a skull to work off of. But when there's no skull, you're working merely from old photographs. You have to know the aging process and what happens and where to go. And Frank has done a number of these in years past. Serial murder, then. Let's talk a little about serial murder. Different than mass murder. One subject, more than 3 victims, more than 3 events, more than 3 locations in different times, different places, with a cooling off period in between. And that cooling off period is important because it differentiates between the serial and the mass killer. The mass killer is usually killing in a state of high emotion. The mass killer is generally a reaction of a person with mental illness. As I said, paranoia and manic depression seem to be the depressed states, seem to be the basis of their crimes. And generally speaking, your mass murders don't have a criminal history. Serial killers is more of a developmental thing that really starts in childhood and kind of goes on through life with great deals of fantasy that lead the individual to fantasize of victimizing other human beings and treating people basically as objects for their own perverse pleasures. Great deal of difference between serial and mass killers, and yet back in the 70s and 60s, everybody was referred to as a mass killer. Serial killer wasn't used until about into the late 70s, mid to late 70s. Most recently, you had the case of Andrew Cunanan, who started his killing spree up in the Midwest, carried it across the country, Chicago, on to New Jersey, and down to Florida, where he killed Gianni Versace. And the world was calling this guy at large a serial killer. Police were identifying him as a serial killer. The FBI was identifying him as a serial killer and indicating that he was stalking celebrities. The assessment of Cunanan was completely really flawed very badly. He was, in fact, what I call a spree killer. And a spree killer is essentially, a simplest explanation of a spree killer, far different than this, is a mass killer on the move. The dynamics that drive the mass killer, basically the life stress situations, failed lifestyles, drive this individual, but basically it becomes a mobile form of mass homicide. It starts in one location and moves and continues to move across sometimes a city, sometimes across counties, states, and sometimes across the country. Christopher Wilder, back in the early 80s, was a spree killer who started in Miami, went clear across the United States through Texas. I think it went I-10, right on through the country, up the West Coast, and came back across the northern part of the United States, and in fact ended up in New Hampshire, where he was literally stopped by the New Hampshire State Police in a fight with one of the police officers. He was actually shot and killed during that scuffle. But a spree killer is far different than a serial killer, and in fact their movements and their actions can be premeditated, I think, quite well. You can kind of get ahead of them if in fact you know what you're dealing with. One thing that impacted me most recently is I drove down from really Washington, D.C. area down to Florida, all the way down to Jacksonville on I-95, and went straight on down, took I-10 then into the Panhandle, where that was my destination. But what impressed me was the fact that since the Cunanan thing had just wrapped up, all the way down I looked for a red Chevy long bed new truck, because that's what Cunanan was driving. And it just occurred to me, since he picked up a vehicle, or he picked up the vehicle up in New Jersey, but he got a license plate in Florence, South Carolina. He stopped off and got a license plate. He must have taken I-10 all the way down into Miami. I'm sorry, I-95. So, I mean, the fact is that if a simple thing like law enforcement was alerted just to look for this particular type of vehicle, all the way down I didn't see one vehicle like that. I saw red pickup trucks. They were Dodges, they were Mazdas. On the way back I saw two red Chevy pickup trucks, long bed, of the variety that Cunanan was driving. So in other words, what I'm saying is that type of vehicle was significantly unique. That, if they just had in each state just a lookout, just a surveillance on 95 going south, the major thoroughfares going north and west, Cunanan didn't make any attempts to go back roads or anything else. He sailed right down I-95, in my belief, and nobody really was looking for that vehicle, because they were believing he was some sort of a insidious serial killer who was stalking around, killing notable people, gay people, etc. It just goes to show how you can misperceive and misunderstand what you're dealing with. Premeditation and planning becomes a real element of your serial killer, and in between their crimes, after cooling off, they premeditate and plan the next crime. George Metesky. Here we have a mad bomber of New York City, an individual who bombed New York City for some 17 years, sending cryptic messages to the police. And in fact, what we had here was a form of a serial bomber. And in fact, he would send these letters to the media. Most recently, you've had David Kaczynski, who is now just about now going into court. David Kaczynski, known as the Unabomber, who was sending bombs all over the United States for a period of about 17 years, but the same as this individual, really the same as John List, 17 years. It's kind of an uncanny number. But the parallels between Kaczynski and George Metesky, who was caught after 17 years of bombing up in the New York area, were so similar that it was, again, it's uncanny how similar patterns take shape among like offenders. And that's basically what I did in research, is trying to chart what these people do. The first serial killer that I really went back to, I went further back than this in a sense, but the first one I looked at in depth was an individual named William Herons in Chicago. And this man kind of impacted me because as a kid I remember this case very, very well. William Herons killed a number of women, to include a 6-year-old girl. When I was a kid, 12 years of age, this is the first time I had exposure to a serial killer via the media. He was killing and he was writing cryptic messages on the wall in very poor picture here, but the only one available that I know of. It says, it's not all there, "For heaven's sake, stop me before I kill again. I cannot control myself." Here's a guy that kills somebody, sexually assaults, murders a woman, really bathes her body after her death, bandages up some of the wounds, puts her in a fresh nightgown, puts her in bed, tucks her in as if she were sleeping, and then writes on the wall, "For heaven's sake, stop me before I kill more. I cannot control myself." As I say, as a young kid, 12, 13 years of age, this thing really kind of grabbed a hold of me and probably put me exactly where I am today on this podium, following a career of trying to get into the abyss of the minds of violent offenders. Once I got into the FBI, once I got into the behavioral science unit and started this research project, one of the first offenders I decided to start with from serial killers, going back as far as possible, was the 40s. 1946 was William Herons, who in fact was the first known serial killer in Chicago, again, that came to any great deal of attention. You can go back to the Middle Ages and before for serial homicide, but the one that really grabbed the headlines was William Herons. Herons killed several young women, in the fashion that I described. His last victim was a 6-year-old girl by the name of Suzanne Degnan, that he killed, sexually assaulted, dismembered in about a dozen parts, and put her body parts in sewers, various sewers around the Chicago-Evanston border of the Chicago area. He was caught during the act of a burglary. He had committed hundreds of burglaries. He was a fetish burglar. And again, many of the dynamics that I have seen in similar offenders, the escalation, the development of these hostile tendencies over a period of a lifetime, starting in pre-adolescence and going on through adolescence, usually are present over and over again. My book, Sexual Homicide Patterns and Motives, has one chapter called Growing Up to Murder. And exactly what that was about was charting these aberrant behavior and fantasy patterns that these like offenders share, and to the extent some of them get to this extent of going on to becoming a serial killer. They all kind of go through this checklist before they get on up to the actual event of human offense, and that generally doesn't come until early to mid-20s, sometimes later. I have had cases where they have started violent actions in their adolescence. The youngest one that I've had that really got into serial homicide had killed 5 women by the time he was 17 years of age. And I still correspond with this guy to this day. He writes me frequently. Mr. Herons here was caught during the act of a burglary. He had committed hundreds of burglaries. He was a fetish burglar, breaking into homes for sexual purposes, playing out fantasies in the homes that he broke into, women's undergarments, all that sort of thing. Here he was apprehended, must have stumbled during the arrest process, and the Chicago police officers are helping him back up to his feet. It seems he struck his head on the sidewalk, I believe, is what happened here. Or was it a nightstick? Well, I don't know. Something of that sort. And here Mr. Herons is describing his crimes, showing this very sink where the little girl was dismembered. But interesting twist in this case back then is all that Herons was describing was through a third person, as he would indicate George Merman was the killer, and Merman had informed Herons of all these facts, and even showed in the sewers that Herons would lead the police to, where body parts were found. And in fact, the plea here was in fact multiple personality disorder, one of the first cases that I know of where back then it was called hysterical neurosis, I believe. Today we call it MPD, multiple personality disorder, where in fact Herons and Merman were one and the same. Judge sentenced Merman to life imprisonment, and Herons has to stay with him during this time. Herons is now up in his late 60s and still entertains fantasies of getting out. And as I say, I did interview Mr. Herons, and it was quite an interesting interview. A lot of cases. I mentioned Pierce Brooks here a while back, who was the original founder of the BICAP system, the retired chief of police chief of homicide rather of the Los Angeles Police Department, LAPD. Pierce is now in retirement. One case that Pierce shared with me was a guy named Harvey Murray Glattman, and we studied his case and found again, historically, this was a beginning of what many cases would follow this type of serial killer. Glattman back in the 50s was victimizing young women, oftentimes getting them to come to him through trick, through lure, whatever, and offering them jobs as models for his photography business, telling the women that they would be posing for the covers of detective magazines. And Glattman had a very much of a fantasy around the detective magazines. He had Pierce said that he found dozens and dozens of these in his possession. Pictures where on the covers where you find women with really frightened looks on their face, under control of some male here, knife to the throat. All of these control, power, dominance issues on the covers of detective magazines. And through this case that Pierce told me about, that he worked back in the 50s, I began doing these prison interviews, asking violent offenders what really was their turn on, and oftentimes they said detective magazines. They really liked detective magazines. Collected many detective magazines over their lifetime. And I started looking at detective magazines. We started researching the issue. And in fact, we got many issues of detective magazines, finding out what ads were in there, and again correlating to that with what I heard in the prisons from the offenders. And it's the concept of the power and the control and the authority, the dominance over the female, turning the female into an object. Almost every detective magazine has either this on the cover or many stories inside about sexual and violent assaults against mainly women, sometimes younger women, occasionally males, but essentially the magazine has the same theme over and over again. Most recently, I worked a case in Charlotte, North Carolina. It was early this year, of a man named Henry Wallace, who was a serial killer, killed 11 women. When I went in and did the interviews with him, I had noted in his record that he was an avid reader of detective magazines, and as I had done with many others, I brought a stack of detective magazines, pulled them out of my briefcase, and gave them to him, and had him tell me what was his interest in these magazines. Not that detective magazines on their own are a catalyst to violent crime, but it's interesting that the violent offender has a keen interest in this type of sadomasochistic type of literature. And of course, what Glattman would do here is he would lure his victims to pose for these magazines, and in fact, this young lady here was one of the victims. He actually kept her photographs, and in fact, as he had many others, had a collection of photographs. And of course, you can see the look of fear on the young woman's face here, the look in her eyes, gagged, tied up. At this point, she realizes this is probably not the best job she's ever going to have. In fact, it was the last job she had, along with 7 other young women who ended up their bodies disposed out in deserts, responding to these ads of kind of cheap, easy way of making some good money quickly without any particular talent. Responding to something of that nature is never a good idea. In our town, Spotsylvania, where these 3 girls were missing, I turned up a young woman right now that responded to an ad. She called me up on the phone. A guy in the paper claimed to be an artist and was asking for young models. And when she called, she was 15 years of age, he started asking some very suggestive things about her body and this and that and the other thing. And again, it's the type of thing that's a little bit suspicious, and I turned that over to the local police, who are still looking for this character. Today, I think we have seen again escalation of this type of thing through the decades. Today, you're now getting into the era where the internet becomes a vehicle for meeting people and being whatever you want to be, on the internet. You can be a male, you can be a female, you can be young, you can be old. You get into chat rooms or private chat rooms or whatever, and you can establish communications. And of course, just recently there was a thing on television here where a young boy in California was lured to Fairfax, Virginia, where he was found in the home of a pedophile. And happily, this kid was taken back to his parents before anything happened of any great seriousness, but others have not been so lucky. There was a case in New York not long ago where a woman met Mr. Wonderful on the internet, went to visit him in North Carolina, and ended up buried in his backyard. So I think this is a new era with the internet. We're going to see a lot of people exploiting it. Of course, they have already. They are doing it now, but to the extent of not just grossing people out, but in fact seeking out and obtaining victims through cyberspace. I'm going to take a break here in a second. First, I'll entertain some questions. Do we have any questions from the floor? Yeah. Right here. Yeah, stand up and speak loudly because... we have microphones set up, don't we? I think there's... Is this one here? No. Yeah, I think it is. We have one up here, too.
Well, as a student interested in the field of criminal profiling, what majors would you suggest?
I think I missed that.
As a student interested in the field of criminal profiling with the Federal Bureau, what majors would you suggest for...
that's a difficult question to really address for me, because the whole field of criminal profiling is such that it's emerging into it's an adjunct of sort to the law enforcement field. There is no one career path. There is no one academic path that one can pursue that will guarantee him any sort of career in this field. I think, from my own standpoint, I kind of created my own field. It emerged as I emerged through the military and on into the FBI. The FBI now does have a career path of sort for people in the field of criminal profiling. It's one organization that does, the FBI. But as far as an entrance, I'd have to say that, in my belief, I think that the best way to get into this type of work is to have a good balance within a criminal justice program with a strong, say, a minor in psychology, something along the lines of strong courses in the behavioral sciences, along with the criminal justice balance. I think on a graduate level, actually the field of psychology, it would not be a bad way to go. I think from experience factor, I think doing work in prisons, prison counseling, that sort of thing would be a very good way to go. The fact is as I say, within the FBI, with an interest and an appropriate background, one can after getting into their first office, can declare an interest in this area and can actually get to work in this area with the existing criminal profile agent, and in fact can steer themselves over a career path to the FBI Behavioral Science Unit at Quantico over a period of years. Quantico won't take anybody. Last time I heard it was like 5 to 7 years of field service before they would entertain taking anybody into the Behavioral Science Unit. But they can work that specialty in the field almost immediately with a certain amount of basic training. Beyond the FBI, there's really kind of as I say, it varies. I'd mentioned the police fellowship, where we brought in police officers from all over the United States, train them for a year, and send them back to their departments. Those departments, for example, L.A., Sacramento, I think Sacramento, Los Angeles Sheriff's Office, Los Angeles Police Department, Seattle Police Department, Chicago. There are a number of departments where these police fellows have gone back and established their own programs, and in fact are now carrying those programs on. I know in England there's a course at University at Liverpool in investigative psychology, and that is the closest thing I know of that would really direct a person along the lines of criminal profiling as a specialty. Doug, do you have any comments on that? You're more into the academics than I, as far as a career path.
Well, no, I think, Bob, like you said, I tell them that their undergraduate degree is in criminal justice. Then really what they need to do is really concentrate on the side degree. Like you said, that's generally what I was doing.
Of course, keeping in mind that there really is not at this stage of the game any position that I know of in any police department for a criminal profiler. There are positions for criminologists, there are positions for police psychologists, and in fact the ones that work in this area that I know of, both inside and outside the FBI, basically do this as an adjunct to their normal police service. Full-time work in this area, few and far between, positions in this area. But I firmly believe the way things have been going, and I'll tell you, I used to go to Scotland Yard and just talk to these people back in the 70s, and over the years, they were just some interest. There was a little bit of interest here and there. Over the past 20 years, they have gone from just being interested to now they just a few years ago opened up what they call their National Crime Faculty at Bram's Hill, where is a location of the British Police College. And in concert with the Scotland Yard, they have research, they have assigned people, they have over 25 people working this now, they have a profiling program, they train psychologists from outside police service to work with their profile officers, and they've got a full-fledged program going now with a career field, and that's in Scotland Yard. So, I mean, what you're seeing is an emergence. I think beyond the year 2000, I really believe that this field is going to expand, and of course TV shows like The Profiler and Millennium and X-Files and all those sort of things are generating even more so people's interest in this sort of thing, although not always for the right reasons, I might add. I'm a technical consultant to the Profiler series this season, and I'm going to try to build into it a little more reality and get away from this psychic flashing stuff that they... If you watch those things, you'd believe your profiler goes into the room and boom, boom, you get these flashes and, all sorts of... It's almost like a psychic experience, and I'm trying to... They say, well, it's visual. It, shows the audience, tries to create that image of, getting mental flashes, but it comes off too much like psychic phenomena. Any other questions? Yeah. Thing work? Should have a little switch on there somewhere. Wait a minute, that's a hand grenade. Let's try that one.
We have a beginning graduate psychology program on this campus in forensic psychology. Would you recommend that particular program if this was your career interest?
I really don't know anything about that program. It sounds, from the description, certainly, it's called forensic psychology?
Yes, sir.
Yeah, that certainly sounds like something that I would be interested in if I were, starting over again. Actually, I did a lot of the pulling together of courses on my own, but the forensic application, of course, is very important. Of course, in the field of psych, you have to start out with the learning process and all the kind of the boring stuff that goes into the required courses, but directing eventually towards the field of forensic psychology is important. A psychologist, a psychiatrist, might be a knowledgeable person, but on a criminal application, they're oftentimes totally useless. When you take a pure psychiatrist or psychologist and try to interject them into a police investigation, just doesn't work. When they have studied along the lines of the forensic application and dedicate their studies to that area and direct their career to the court system and the criminal justice system, they become far more valuable. Certainly far more valuable. Had an experience in London, kind of a bad experience. My last book, I Have Lived in the Monster, I talk about a case in England, and of course I'd spent so many years trying to get the British up to speed and using profiling. They had a tremendous case called the Wimbledon Common Murder in England, and they enlisted the aid of a psychologist in that case who really did a pretty good profile, and he did quite well, but then they actually start using him. They came up with a suspect, and they start using the psychologist in a proactive way they enlisted his assistance in writing letters for a policewoman who was targeting this suspect and trying to communicate with him via letters that the psychologist was writing to more or less get him to admit to this murder, this Wimbledon Common murder, a woman out in the Wimbledon Common forest grounds out there, and the psychologist went overboard. I mean, he just started relating to his own field and getting further and further away from the criminal application, the criminal justice application, and it ended up getting thrown out of court. And I personally think that they let the guilty party go, but they blew the case because they entrapped him with these letters. So again, I think a person with a little more forensic background would have avoided getting that deep into the investigation. Any other questions? Yeah.
Mr. Ressler?
No. Somebody.
Up here.
Oh, where are you?
I was wondering if the Radish ever admitted that he made a mistake in shooting your CPRP program down?
I didn't hear that at all. Can you translate for me?
The former director of the FBI that you called the Radish in your book, Whoever Fights Monsters.
Yeah.
Can you hear that?
What about the Radish? Yeah.
Did he ever admit that he made a mistake when he shot down your program?
You're going to have to. It just sounds garbled from here.
Did he ever make a mistake? Did he ever admit to making a mistake when you trashed your program?
Oh, the Radish?
Yeah.
Well, the Radish was I'm sorry I can't hear you up here, but it's from down here. It's just all garbled. The Radish was what I would call an old-time Hoover type FBI guy. He had been around since the early days, and he was at the tail end of his career. He saw everything. He was a high-level guy. He was up there, one of the top half a dozen people in the bureau. And I'm not saying he was wrong in one sense. He saw what we were doing in the behavioral science unit as being totally it was just out of context with what he believed the FBI was supposed to do. And he thought we were delving into areas of, he said he wanted to see me face to face, wanted to talk to me, he wanted to see if I had a ponytail, indicating that he thought I was kind of going, left wing over the edge, and that we weren't doing FBI work. So They called him the Radish because he always had a red face. He had a kind of high blood pressure, and he always had this beet red appearance. And, he just disapproved what we were doing. But like I say, I just waited my time until he retired and then tried it again. And the next one that came in, really, the director, William Webster, came in about that time. And Webster had a whole different perspective on where the Bureau should be going, changed some of the priorities, and totally sanctioned the research that we were doing in Quantico. We'll take one more and then we'll take a break.
Yes, sir, Mr. Ressler, I wanted to know, in your opinion, who was the most intriguing or interesting serial murderer that you ever got to interview, and what are your reasons for believing that?
You might think I don't speak English here or something, but the acoustics here are such that all I'm hearing is booming and garbling. What do you say? The most interesting serial killer that I ever interviewed, and why, let's see. I'm going to defer that until after the break, because we'll go into the John Gacy case, John Wayne Gacy, and I think he probably would qualify as one of the most interesting. I want to talk about a number of others. Gacy was interesting from the standpoint of he stuck to his story all the way to the end that he was innocent, when in fact he told me one-on-one early in his, after he was incarcerated, that he did kill. He never admitted killing all, but at one point he committed to killing 3/4 of these kids. And every time you'd see him, he'd change his story. He was an individual that I think believed that as long as he lied, he could sustain a appeal. And he did. He went through 3 appeals before he was finally executed. He was one, and I'll talk about, after the break, I'll talk about him. I'll also talk about Jeffrey Dahmer. And I think Dahmer was a very interesting individual from the standpoint that Dahmer, unlike Gacy, was not the highly organized type that Gacy was, but Dahmer was, the way I describe him, he had 1 foot in madness and 1 foot in insanity. He was kind of a mixed type of personality, but his personal fantasies just went to the unbelievable ends in the way he would act out his murders. A third one I'd like to talk about after the break would be Richard Trenton Chase, who is known as a vampire killer of Sacramento, California. And this individual, probably where Gacy was highly organized, Dahmer was somewhat mixed, I would call Richard Trenton Chase totally disorganized. And this is a man who believed he had to kill to sustain his life by drinking human blood. So he's a modern-day vampire. Not the Bram Stoker variety, the sucking of blood through the little holes in the neck. This guy got right down to the program. He opened you up from here to here and then took a cup and scooped it in there and just had himself a good old time. And unlike the vampires, the Dracula types that suck the blood from the little holes, this guy would take your blood and put it into a blender, maybe throw in your heart and liver just to kind of enhance the brew, and then kind of whip it up into a frothy blood malt, which he would ingest. But he did this, with a great deal of enthusiasm, believing that he was going to preserve his life because his blood supply was drying up and turning to powder. So I'll tell you about these guys after the break, and tonight you'll probably have spaghetti or lasagna or something. Okay, let's take a break. Yeah, I can cut that. I was one of the last people to contact him before his execution, and I'd interviewed him a number of times in between. I was out at the crime scenes working with the police during the ongoing investigation. So I've got a long history with John Wayne Gacy. Thought to have killed 33. I believe he really was responsible for far more than 33 homicides. I think he traveled to 14 states during the time that these 33 homicides went on over a period of 5 years, from the mid-'70s to the early '80s. And I firmly believe that he probably killed half again as many, if not more, bringing his total up to over 50, 60 homicides. I worked diligently for years trying to get Gacy to admit to this sort of thing, and he played and toyed with me and, never would come across. The other case I mentioned was Richard Trenton Chase, the vampire killer of Sacramento, California, and who is a vampire killer, truly a modern-day, real-live vampire. And I've interviewed this guy at length, worked on his case, did the profiles that assisted in the police in catching Mr. Chase, and he did commit suicide in prison. Gacy, of course, was executed on May 10th, 1994. Both of these cases were highlighted in a television special that I worked on most recently on the Discovery Channel called The Mine Hunters. And I'm going to play that. If you've seen it before, I think you'll see a little more in it this time. And afterwards, I will show you the crime scenes, the actual crime scenes from the Gacy case when I was on the scenes with the police officers as those things were ongoing, and give you a little more insight into Gacy. So let's take a look at this video, and I think you'll find it rather interesting.
A teenager is missing. A police investigation exposes the deaths of dozens of boys and young men. All are traced to a single killer. A photographer turns to rape and torture, meticulously documenting his crimes on film and audio tape. In a quiet suburb, 4 people are found dead. Police wonder about the kind of madman who could commit this crime. For serial killers, one death is just the beginning. Obsessed, they strike again and again, learning more with each crime, improving, perfecting. They're confident they'll never be stopped. But the mind hunters work tirelessly for their capture. It's just after 6 o'clock on January 23rd, 1978, in California, when Sacramento County Police arrive at the home of Terry and David Wallen. They are called there by a neighbor at David's frantic request. 22-year-old Terry Wallen has been brutally murdered. The house shows signs of an intense struggle between Wallen and her killer. She has been shot and her body slashed. A large knife wound runs the length of her torso. Some of her internal organs have been removed. Investigators are horrified by the viciousness of the crime. The scene becomes more gruesome when they find evidence that suggests the killer might have consumed Wallen's blood. Officers find a yogurt cup with bloody lip prints around the rim. Sacramento police don't know what to make of the scene, but they know who can help them. They call on a specialist, a man who's familiar with horrific and bizarre murder cases. His name is Russ Vorpagel. He is a special agent with the FBI. The brutality of the slaying makes Vorpagel fear that the murderer couldn't control himself, and that Terry Wallen's death may be just the beginning of his rampage.
There's just no need to disembowel a victim. There's no need to reach inside and cut out body parts. There's no need to cut a 4-inch piece of major artery and take it along with you. I mean, hey, we knew we had a nut and we were worried and we knew that something's going to happen.
Vorpagel called a colleague at the FBI. Robert Ressler has tracked and caught some of the world's most dangerous killers. As a criminal profiler for the FBI, he stakes out the darkest corners of a killer's mind. In the 1970s, he was one of the first to use the term serial killer to describe those who murder again and again. Robert Ressler is a mind hunter. Ressler struggles to understand the killer's mind by studying the crime scene. Knowing how the killer thinks is essential to predicting his next move. When will he strike? Who will he target?
You have to have a emotional need to solve a crime. You have to want to know who the offender was. You have to know what that person is, what he's like, what he was like before, during, and after the crime.
But there is a danger in identifying too closely with those who destroy. Ressler heeds the words of German philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche, who wrote that whoever fights monsters should not become a monster himself, and that when one looks into an abyss, the unblinking abyss stares directly back. For Robert Ressler, Nietzsche's observation is motivation and warning.
Looking into the abyss to me means looking into the depths, the deep crevices, the dark crevices of man's human mind. And when it says the abyss looks back, to me that means I'm looking back at myself. I'm seeing my reflection. Because in every horrible killer, yourself is in there somewhere, in part. Somewhere in your life you could have gone that same road.
In the 1970s, Ressler was among the original members of the FBI's Behavioral Science Unit, the first FBI program to systematically research a killer's motivations. Ressler interviewed some of America's most notorious murderers in prison to learn about their habits and attitudes. Today, Ressler is a private consultant who works all over the world to help solve serial murders. In January of 1978, Ressler applied his knowledge to help Sacramento County investigators devise a psychological profile of Terry Wallen's murderer. It was the first step in tracking the killer. Ressler began his profile by examining the crime scene details.
What you look for at a crime scene is the positioning of the body, the way the body was left by the killer. You look at the state of the body from the standpoint of being clothed or unclothed. And, of course, you're looking for available weaponry, or did the killer take a weapon to the scene, use it, and take it away? These are all things that you really start sizing up in your head.
After Terry Wallen was shot, the killer cut her body with knives taken from her own kitchen. Then he left them in plain sight at the scene, a detail that would prove instructive for Ressler. Because the greatest number of serial killers are male, at the time, Vorpagel and Ressler conclude their suspect is a man. They also assume he's white, like the majority of American serial killers. The brutality of the crime and the killer's apparent disregard for leaving evidence behind convince the pair their subject is mentally ill. That helps them pinpoint the killer's age. Ressler knows that mental illness usually begins in adolescence. It would take at least 8 years for the killer to grow sick enough to perform the acts of violence he inflicted on Terry Wallen. Assuming symptoms began at age 15, Ressler figures the killer would be in his mid to late 20s. Any older, and he would have already committed several gruesome homicides. Ressler goes further. He believes the killer to be schizophrenic, a mental illness characterized by delusions, hallucinations, and bizarre behavior. heinous nature of the crime points to full-blown psychosis, a total loss of contact with reality. Because he drinks the blood of his victims, investigators call him the vampire killer. From his office in Virginia, Ressler works feverishly with Vorpagel in Sacramento to refine the killer's profile. What would he look like? They are convinced police should look for someone thin. Male schizophrenics generally eat poorly when they eat at all. And Russ Vorpagel believes the murderer will pay little attention to his appearance.
A guy that is suffering from a major mental illness is probably going to have a deterioration in his hygiene. Probably doesn't cut his hair, wears the same clothes for weeks at a time, doesn't brush his teeth, is scroungy looking.
Given his bizarre behavior, the killer would likely live alone. Vorpagel delivers a copy of the profile to the Sacramento police to circulate throughout the county. But no strong suspect emerges. The vampire killer remains at large. Will the profilers find him before he kills again? Three days after Terry Wallen's brutal murder in 1978, less than a mile away from her house, the vampire killer strikes again. Police find the bodies of Daniel Meredith, Evelyn Miroth, and her son Jason. Missing and presumed dead is Miroth's 22-month-old nephew, Michael Ferriera. These new deaths convince Ressler and Vorpagel that unless this murderer is found quickly, he will strike again. The mind hunters redouble their efforts. Using information gathered from this crime scene, they refine their original profile. Again, the vampire killer shot his victims. Again, he used knives taken from the victim's kitchen. Two knives are found in the room, and another was found outside. He doesn't seem to care that he's left the weapons behind. These details tell profilers that the killer is not planning his crimes. Although he brings a gun, he cuts the bodies with weapons he finds at the scene and then leaves them there.
We have a knife that was used to mutilate the bodies. It was taken from the kitchen, used on the victim, and then discarded at the crime scene. Seeing this for a second time definitely reinforced in my mind that we were dealing with a highly disorganized killer.
Organized and disorganized. These words describe a serial killer's behavior before, during, and after a murder. Organized serial killers carefully plot their moves. They cover their trail so thoroughly that little or no evidence remains to tie them to their crimes. By contrast, disorganized serial killers act on impulse. Their behavior is random, making their next move difficult to predict. Investigators find bloodstains in the bathtub. Profilers believe the vampire killer may have bathed in a mixture of water and blood. The crimes are becoming more gruesome and the killer more deranged and more disorganized.
Now, we know darn well that your normal everyday person is not going to fill a tub with water and bathe in the blood. So here we see personality. Here we see mental illness. We see mental deterioration.
From the evidence at the crime scene, Vorpagel and Ressler reconstruct the grisly sequence of events. And the terrifying portrait of a man they've never seen begins to emerge. The evidence reinforces the mind hunter's belief that the vampire killer's appearance will continue to deteriorate. He likely won't have changed his clothes. Unless he is single and living alone, the killer can't possibly escape notice. Their subject is a thin, disheveled loner, not more than 30 years old. Investigators are puzzled when murder victim Daniel Meredith's stolen red station wagon turns up a short distance away. Because it was found nearby, Ressler determines the vampire killer must have walked to the crime scene and then fled on foot after abandoning the car.
The killer would be residing within a very close distance to that abandoned car. I said approximately 1/4 mile.
The day after the Miroth murders, police receive an unrelated report that a dog has been shot and mutilated within blocks of the crime scene. For the mind hunters, it's the break they've been looking for. They know that as children, serial killers often mutilate or kill animals.
And he would go out and kill these pets, shooting them with the same gun he shot Wallen and Miroth and Meredith. Same gun. He'd shoot these pets. And then he'd gut them and drink their blood.
As more animals are found dead, the circle closes. The mind hunters are convinced that the vampire killer lives near the slaughtered animals and his human victims. He won't have traveled far. Police circulate the revised profile throughout the city in hopes that someone may have seen a disheveled or strange-acting man. Officers concentrate on a 1/4 mile radius of the murders. As a woman in her late 20s is leaving a Sacramento shopping center, a strange man approaches her. Hearing of the vampire killer murders, the woman contacts police. The man she eluded at the shopping center, she tells officers, is a former high school classmate, Richard Trenton Chase. She was shocked by his appearance. He had bloodstains on his sweatshirt. His eyes seemed sunk into their sockets. A yellowed crust was around his mouth. According to the woman's description, Chase fits the profile of the vampire killer. Armed with a search warrant, officers enter Chase's home. They're unprepared for what they find. Nazi paraphernalia dominates the small apartment. The place is littered with pamphlets about alien conspiracies. The chaos in the living room fits the profile of someone with an equally chaotic mind. In the kitchen, police find appliances spattered with blood, as well as newspaper articles about the murder of Terry Wallen. Several dishes in the refrigerator contain human tissue. In a kitchen drawer are knives taken from Wallen's home. Investigators also find a toolbox and blood-stained rubber boots. Chase is arrested and charged with 6 counts of first-degree murder, including the killing of Evelyn Miroth's nephew, 22-month-old Michael Ferriera, whose remains are found not far from Chase's apartment. The jury deliberates only a few hours before pronouncing Chase guilty on all counts. The sentence: death in the electric chair. In 1979, Robert Ressler decided to talk to Chase in prison.
The reason I interviewed him, very frankly, was to validate, to do an update and validate the profiling work that I had done, to talk to him directly after working on the case, after seeing the crime scenes, after reading the police reports, and of course the court records. It's a way you really fine-tune your profiling.
Chase tells Ressler that he had killed only to preserve his own life. He needed blood, Chase says, to survive what he called soap dish poisoning. Chase believed that a gooey residue under his soap dish proved he was dying. He claimed his blood was drying out and corroding his body. His killings, Chase contended, were made in self-defense.
When he got down to the motivation, he said that the blood in his veins, the blood throughout his entire body, was turning to powder or dust, and that it was moving very slowly through his body, causing him to slow down, causing him to be fatigued and become very ill. And he felt this was being done, of course, he said, by the influence of the unidentified flying objects and the aliens. And he said that the only way he could counter this was to get a fresh supply of human blood.
What drives a man like Chase to murder? One FBI study of 36 serial killers revealed that although most began life in two-parent homes, by age 2, almost half the boys' fathers had abandoned their families. Nearly half of the surveyed offenders reported cold or uncaring relationships with their mothers. 26 reported such relationships with their fathers. Nearly 70% of the families had histories of alcohol abuse. 1/3 had histories of drug abuse. Almost all reported some form of childhood psychological, physical, or sexual abuse. As children, many serial killers tortured animals. The majority did not graduate from high school. While the men had the required intelligence to perform skilled jobs, most had poor work histories. Only 20%, or 6 offenders, had ever managed to hold on to steady work. Yet, to all appearances, serial killers seem normal, like your neighbor or your friend.
Most of these people are like everyday people. They oftentimes are intelligent, they're attractive, they're good conversationalists. IQ's usually up about, at least high normal or beyond, and they're very deceptive.
Ressler was opposed to the death sentence for Chase. Chase, he argued, was mentally ill and should have been locked up for life in a prison hospital. Prison psychiatrists eventually agreed. Chase's sentence was commuted to life in the California Medical Facility in Vacaville. But Chase killed himself in his prison cell just after Christmas, 1980. He had stockpiled his antidepressant pills and then taken them all at once. Richard Trenton Chase's brief and chaotic reign of terror had come to an end. In contrast, one of America's most cunning serial killers was also one of the most organized. Highly intelligent and a talented photographer, this murderer specialized in kidnapping, rape, and torture. Police called him the unidentified subject, or unsub. He was a master of planning. He used film and audio tape to record his crimes. In a rented storage shed, he stockpiled pictures of his victims and recordings of their anguished cries. He was so meticulous that he would leave virtually no evidence of his atrocities, except for the photographs he took himself. Unsub customized his cars to resemble unmarked police cars. He added heavy-duty suspensions and strong restraints so that once inside, his victims had virtually no chance of escape. For 5 years, he traveled from state to state, never staying in one place too long. He was self-reliant, financing his crimes of kidnapping, rape, and torture with yet another crime. He was a skilled counterfeiter. He was confident, that he would never be caught. In Manassas, Virginia, a team of former FBI agents pursue some of the world's most dangerous criminals. They call themselves the Academy Group. Between them, they have amassed years of experience investigating serial killings. Robert Hazelwood and Peter Smerrick are experts in psychological profiling of criminals.
If you in life are an impulsive person, you act without thinking, well then that crime scene may be very, very sloppy and be a reflection of your impulsive acts. On the other hand, if in life you're a cold, calculating individual, you don't take any unnecessary risks, well, that type of behavior can also be demonstrated at a crime scene.
Even with crime scene evidence, categorizing serial killers is difficult. Some serial killers demonstrate a mixture of disorganized and organized habits.
All too often, if an investigator starts looking at a crime scene and tries to put the offender into one of these nice, neat little categories, he's going to be disappointed when the person he arrests doesn't fit these categories in all areas.
In the seaside resort of Ocean City, Maryland, a young woman has just finished her shift at a convenience store. It is Memorial Day weekend, 1979. She is approached by a man who identifies himself as a police officer. He shows her his identification and is driving an unmarked police car. He tells the woman she is a suspect in a series of robberies, and he insists that she accompany him to police headquarters for questioning. He handcuffs her and pushes her into the car. It's the beginning of the longest and most terrifying experience of the woman's life. The man is no police officer. He is unsub. And she's his latest victim. He takes her to a deserted building where he repeatedly rapes and tortures her. He photographs and tape records the ordeal.
I think one of the buzzwords today that we use is power and control. And whether you're dealing with a rapist, whether you're dealing with a serial killer, I think it still comes down to those two basic elements: power and control over the life of another individual.
Eventually, he will push the dazed woman back into his car and take her for one last ride.
He stops the automobile, opens up the passenger door, and rolls the woman out into a ditch. But he did not kill her. He allowed this victim to live. And as a result, within a number of hours, when daylight came, she was found, she was rescued, and now became a full-fledged FBI investigation for kidnapping.
The FBI set up a massive manhunt for unsub. The Ocean City woman was the latest in a long list of his victims. Some were tortured, others murdered. But many years passed before there was a break in the case. At the same time the FBI searched for unsub, the Secret Service was on the trail of an elusive counterfeiter, a man who routinely passed fake $20 bills to unsuspecting store clerks at malls and shops in the Midwest and on the East Coast.
The one thing about any law enforcement agency, no matter how good we are, you need an element of luck, and you need the cooperation of an alert citizenry. In this instance, an alert clerk recognized a composite sketch as a customer who was currently in the store. She notified mall security, Mall security notified local authorities, and within a short period of time, the suspect was apprehended.
The man police arrest is James Mitchell de Bartoleben. The Secret Service soon discovers that de Bartoleben is not just a counterfeiter. Secret Service agents search a storage unit rented by de Bartoleben. Inside are sheaves of the fake currency he's been passing. But to their shock, agents also discover a grotesque treasure trove of pictures and audio tape. The 1983 discovery unmasks the focus of the FBI investigation. Robert Hazelwood, then an FBI special agent who had written a criminal profile of unsub, reviewed the material seized from de Bartoleben's storage unit. Agents find thousands of photographs of de Bartoleben's victims. Among them are photos and audio tape of the woman abducted in Ocean City in 1979. Some of the photos date back to the early 1960s. They find the tools of a killer's trade. Victims' clothing, 10 guns, phony police identification, journals, blood-stained lingerie, and jewelry. 7 license plates allowed de Bartoleben to roam with little fear of his car being traced. The FBI also found handwritten notes. They contained codes that referred to past and future crimes. Although they have uncovered de Bartoleben's cache of damning images and sounds, agents have a problem. The killer's face remains literally out of the frame of the pictures he's taken with the victims. Investigators will have to prove de Bartoleben is the man in the photographs if they are to tie him conclusively to the rapes and deaths. During his FBI career, Peter Smerek was a forensic photography expert. The Secret Service sent him a number of de Bartoleben's photos to analyze. Several show a naked torso and uncovered arms. Smerek focuses his attention on the arms. They have a distinctive pattern of small moles and freckles. Smerek asks the Secret Service to temporarily remove de Bartoleben from his prison cell in order to photograph him in the same position as the person in the confiscated photos. The gambit pays off. When Smerek compares the photographs taken by the Secret Service to the ones found in the storage unit, he finds the patterns of freckles match. It's the proof agents desperately seek.
In all the years that I've worked as a criminal profiler, I can't think of another case where the offender was such an excellent photographer that unknowingly he took his own crime scene photographs, which ended up putting him in prison.
In 1984, de Bartoleben was tried and convicted. Today, he is in a federal penitentiary in Texas, sentenced to multiple life terms.
De Bartoleben is one of the most dangerous criminals that ever walked the face of the earth, in my opinion. He was able to commit a number of crimes over a number of years in a variety of states and never have those crimes linked to him. That made him extremely dangerous. I think he's involved in a lot more crimes than we're aware of, yes.
By controlling every variable, weapons, location, and victim, the organized serial killer can slip through any dragnet, getting away with murder for years as he hides in plain sight. Such was the case of John Wayne Gacy, a prominent Chicago area businessman. Well liked and respected, Gacy camouflaged a terrible secret. In 1978, in Des Plaines, Illinois, 15-year-old Robert Peast was reported missing. Having learned that Gacy was preparing a remodeling bid for a drugstore where Peast worked, Chief Detective Joseph Kozenzak of the Des Plaines Police Department goes to Gacy's home. Gacy denies knowing Peast. But investigators are suspicious. A background check reveals Gacy was once convicted of the sexual abuse of a teenage boy. Kozenzak places Gacy under surveillance. Initially cooperative with the police, Gacy becomes increasingly surly as Kozenzak's investigation continues.
He had a real mean look in his eyes. You could feel that there was hatred there. And that he really didn't care what we were investigating and was more concerned about trying to stay out of the way.
Gacy threatens a lawsuit if police continue their surveillance. Officers persist, suspecting that Gacy has much to hide. But even they are not prepared for what they'll find. For several weeks in 1978, Des Plaines police didn't let John Wayne Gacy out of their sight. Finally, it came time to search his house. The search uncovers a photo receipt that belonged to Robert Peast, linking Gacy to the boy's disappearance. A more thorough search would reveal even more. Chief Detective Kozenzak was the first to enter Gacy's home.
I was one of the first people that arrived at the house and went in through the back door, walked in. The whole place was just dark and kind of eerie. All the window blinds had been closed. And there was some sense of, I don't know, it was kind of ominous, actually. Because we were starting to believe that there could be people buried underneath Gacy's house based on the information we had gathered.
Police interviewed Gacy's ex-wife, friends, and former employees. Stories came out that Gacy propositioned his workers for sexual favors, that some had disappeared, and that his house had a strange odor. One of his workers suggests they check the crawl space. After rigorous questioning, Gacy admits to detectives that 4 years earlier, in 1974, he killed one of his homosexual partners. Gacy claims the murder was in self-defense. He hid the man's body beneath the floor. Then, Gacy shocks investigators. He confesses that he murdered almost 36 young men and boys, also hiding many of their bodies under the floor. The confessions trigger an intense search for the missing men. Detectives examine the crawl space in the hope of finding Gacy's victims. They uncover 3 decomposing bodies and parts of other bodies. But the police don't stop with the crawl space. Knowing more bodies must be stashed under the house, they cut away the floor to find them. Eventually, they would find bodies buried under the dining room and garage floor. Under the house is a virtual killing field of buried bones and jumbled skeletons. Police arrest Gacy for the murder of Robert Peast, though the bodies they uncovered were dead too long to be the missing boy.
Gacy he figured that the best way not to get caught for his crimes was to keep control of his victims after death. But when you're a psychopath, a sexual psychopath, he figured nobody would ever find those bodies down there because he was too smart, smarter than police, smarter than everybody.
By stashing his victims in his own home, Gacy maintained total control over them, even in death, and could remain confident that no one would ever find them without his knowledge. Such careful attention to detail, from planning to death, is the mark of a highly organized killer.
Everything about the case, especially when viewing the home inside, would indicate that Gacy was highly methodical, very well planned, and that he had thought these crimes out in great detail prior to embarking upon them.
Gacy also dumped his victims in the Des Plaines River. Police recovered 6 more bodies there. One of them was Robert Piest. When it was over, police identified the remains of 33 people.
Bob was very interested in this process because the FBI was formulating within their behavioral science unit kind of an in-depth study of people who commit a series of killings and wanting to know more about them, wanting to understand them, and this was a classic case.
The goal of the FBI's behavioral science unit is to map the mind of the serial killer.
So many people believe that it's the sexual act itself that he's performing with the victim that is of primary importance to him. In reality, it's the entire game that's important to them. The selection process, the surveillance, knowing that I have selected you to become my victim and you don't know it. And then all of the planning that goes into the stages of actually conducting the abduction. And so they are rehearsing this and living this maybe for weeks or months before the actual abduction occurs. And to a certain extent, the sexual activity afterwards may almost be an aftermath.
With each killing, Gacy refined his methods, learned from his mistakes, and improved on his successes. He carefully lured his victims into a well-designed trap, distracting them with weightlifting, plying them with alcohol, and showing pornographic movies.
Bring it down to your chest, all the way down. Okay, bring it up, you can lift it up.
He eventually grew so confident that he brazenly targeted a boy from his own neighborhood. Many victims came to Gacy's home hoping to get a job with his contracting firm. He'd meet with them in his garage. The soundproof garage was designed by Gacy and constructed by his company. A motorized door was the only way in or out. If his victim didn't object, Gacy would demonstrate a magic trick using trick handcuffs.
Like this. Real good, right? Okay. Ready?
After showing how the handcuffs work, Gacy would persuade his victim to try them.
Now, you did it the easy way, the hard way.
Then he would challenge him to attempt the trick behind his back. If the victim agreed, the trap was sprung. Gacy would switch the trick handcuffs for real ones. Once immobilized, the victim was at Gacy's mercy.
Hey, come on, man. 1, 2, 3. Twist it.
Only Gacy knows exactly what happened next.
What, Bobby? Relax.
Like serial rapist and killer James Mitchell DeBartoleben, Gacy thought he had completely covered his tracks. But mementos found during the search of Gacy's home provided key evidence, though police didn't know it at the time. Detectives discovered driver's licenses, belt buckles, rings, and other personal effects. Ressler alerted investigators to the importance of these objects.
We had actually found these items not fully realizing what we had found till after Bob came in and started pointing out to us that to you a belt buckle is not important, but to the person who committed the crime it's very important. It's a visual process to help relive the crime at any given time that he wants to do so.
The souvenirs are a reminder of his past murders and an inspiration to kill again.
To Gacy, this is some sort of a symbol of his success, a reminder. It enhances his fantasy and carries him on to the next victim. Trophies, I call it, for the serial killer, where they kind of enhances their fantasy to have these objects around.
The most disturbing object found in Gacy's house was a map indicating job sites around the United States where he had worked as a contractor. Ressler believes it's likely that Gacy wouldn't have confined his killings to Chicago.
And it only seemed logical that if Gacy's traveling doing this in Chicago, he's doing it elsewhere as well. That's why I firmly believe that John Gacy killed more than the 33 he was convicted of. I think probably maybe twice that number.
Forensic teams dismantled Gacy's house. In all, they recovered 27 bodies there. How many more Gacy killed, police would never know. For 10 years, starting in 1979, Ressler interviewed Gacy in prison. Ressler was surprised to learn that he had grown up 4 blocks from the killer in suburban Chicago. Gacy even remembered delivering groceries to the Ressler family, recalling in detail the distinctive flower pots that Ressler's mother used. Gacy also had darker recollections. He described for Ressler a turbulent relationship with his father. Ressler wasn't surprised. Nearly all the serial killers he knows of tell similar stories.
And it's all doctors. I ran away from home, as you know, when I was 19 years old because I couldn't get along with my father. I mean, he was just overbearing. I was dumb and stupid, never would amount to anything, and so I just took off and just to hell with it. I was gone for 3 months.
From prison, Gacy made a painting and sent it to Ressler. It depicted Gacy dressed in a clown costume.
When I got into clown makeup, I regressed into childhood. It was fun being a clown because you could be yourself or just let yourself go and act a fool. You know how people, if you're a businessman, you've got to keep a certain rapport and stuff like that, and everybody looks for you for an image. But as a clown with the makeup on, you could be slapstick and funny and have a good time. That's why I always enjoyed clowning.
In Gacy's painting, he stands in a grove of evergreen trees, surrounded by balloons. The inscription on the back reads, "You cannot hope to enjoy the harvest without first laboring in the fields." Gacy refused to explain the painting's meaning to Ressler or to anyone else. Ressler believes the painting hints at many more murders Gacy committed.
He said you can get away with a lot of things when you're behaving as a clown because people see you as something funny, they see you as something as amusing. They don't know what's beneath the grease paint. They don't know what's beneath the cloth. He said clowns can get away with murder.
John Wayne Gacy died by lethal injection on May 10, 1994. Since the early years of criminal profiling in the 1970s, other serial murderers have been identified and caught. Such names as Son of Sam, Ted Bundy, and Jeffrey Dahmer have become known to mind hunters and to a public alternately fascinated and repelled by their crimes.
Serial killers are driven by control, by dominance, by discipline, by authority. They have very warped concepts of interaction with another human being. They don't look at another human being as a human being. They look at them as an object.
Robert Ressler believes that serial killing, while not limited to the United States, has intensified in this country since the end of World War II. Part of the reason has to do with a culture that glamorizes and encourages violence.
Culture produces violent crime. I would say 75% of the world's serial killers are American products. It sounds very strange, but it's one of our, it's like America, it's like a baseball, apple pie mom and serial homicide. It's unfortunate, and it's certainly tragic in a sense, but it's one thing in the world of criminology. The United States has absolutely broken all records.
Profilers must take care that the poisonous thoughts of those they track don't pollute their own. For one who stares into the abyss, there is a danger of falling in. Ressler says that mind hunters must work their way back from the brink every day of their lives.
I've maintained a balance, I think, consciously, by isolating myself from the horror of what I see. I go to work at 8, I quit at 5, I go back to a normal life, I have a drink, I watch the news, I cut the grass. I've kept a perspective. I've kept in tune with the mainstream and the normal people of society.
For Ressler, profiling is less about drama than about analysis. Observe, think, conclude, and realize there are no easy or quick answers.
The movie concepts is that the profiler will solve the case. Everybody can fold up their tents and go home. Profiling is one tool in the overall toolbox of the investigator. It gives him one more dimension, one more piece of that puzzle. And when you put it all together, sometimes it's very effective.
Profilers explore the mind's darkest regions, dragging what's hidden into the light of day. Only then can it be examined and learned from.
The value of profiling, as in this case of Richard Chase, is to give the police some concept, some psychological portrait or an image of the logical type of subject that they're looking for, to give them a clear picture, because otherwise it's just an empty room.
These human monsters feel they can never be caught, that they are invulnerable. Yet, with each new victim, each drop of blood, each fiber or DNA strand left at the scene of a crime, the mind hunters probe deeper into the killer's mind. Perhaps the day will come when profilers won't be needed. But for now, the mind hunters will have to continue looking into the abyss.
The Casey case is as I say, to this day, the largest numbers of convicted counts of homicide where, in fact, an individual was sentenced to death for 33 counts of murder. That's it. We're nationwide. Worldwide, I think we've gone even farther. I think I told you that I worked on a case in South Africa in the last couple of years where, in fact, right now they have a guy in court named Moses Sitoli who's been has actually been accused of murdering over 40 women between Pretoria and Johannesburg. And in fact, he is now up in trial. I haven't heard that it's over yet, but I believe that he will be convicted, and that'll be probably 40, 41, 42. I worked with South African police on that case, and everything that I learned in all other serial murder cases, I put into that case. I was surprised because I believe that being in South Africa, that all the rules would change, that the cultural aspects, everything else would change the rules that I had more or less been working on for years and years. I worked very closely with a criminal psychologist, a woman named Mickey Pistorius, PhD, and working with the police service, the South African police service, and she had really studied a great deal of my work and that of others in this field. She was really up to speed by the time I got over there. I mean, she was already ahead of me, and working together, she more or less sorting out the complexities and the differences of the South African culture, working with my knowledge of the violent offender, the serial killer, things started falling into place very rapidly, and I saw very little difference in the patterns that were shaping up in that particular case. A guy by the name of Moses Toley was caught and is now pending, as I said, trial. Worldwide, in recent years, was in Russia. Andrei Chikatilo was an individual who was convicted of 53 counts of homicide in Russia, Rostov, Russia. And on that particular case, I did work with the psychiatrist, Alexander Bukanovsky, who was working very closely with the police in Rostov. And I was communicating with Bukanovsky by fax and phone. And in fact, they did nail down Mr. Chikatilo, and he was charged, tried, sentenced, and eventually executed. They worked rather quickly over there. Within, I think, 6 months, he was put to death. Gacy, as you saw, it took 13 years to get him to the execution stage after 3 unsuccessful appeals. The unfortunate thing in Russia, of course, is that the way the Russians operate, they always get their man. They're kind of like the Canadian Mounties in respect that they always get their man, and they did, because in 53 homicides, I think they executed about a half a dozen, 7 or 8 different people for various murders, and many were in jail for murders that actually Chikatilo had done. I asked on one occasion about the people that were still incarcerated for Chikatilo murders, and they just kind of passed it off. I don't think the Russians are very concerned about straightening out their mistakes. The people that were executed, of course, you can't do anything about those, but that's the way the Russians operate. I found it very interesting back once this Chikatilo case went down in the early 90s when he went to trial, because in the mid-80s, when I was still in the behavioral science unit, I had been contacted by the Russian embassy, and I was in the behavioral science unit. I got a written communication and telephone calls from the Russian embassy asking if I would give them some assistance on serial and multiple homicide. Did I have any public source information, handout material, research papers, etc., that they would be interested in? And back in the mid-'80s, we were still kind of, in a sense, still almost just coming off of a Cold War orientation. And when I had reported to my superiors that I had now been contacted by the Russian embassy who wanted me to come up and have lunch, the bureaucracy went into a panic. Of course, I had to write it up. It went up and down the ladder. Our Division 5, which is the intelligence divisions of the FBI, they totally went berserk. They saw this as some sort of a Russian ploy to do something bad to the FBI or who knows what. In reality, none of us knew at the time, but what was happening, they'd already had Chikatilo's murders going on since the late 70s, mid to late 70s, and they were now seeking assistance without getting too specific. And because of the bureaucracy at hand, I was not allowed to meet with the Russians, and in fact, I don't think anybody did. I think we sent them a package of materials and dropped it at the door and ran or something. I don't know, for fear that they might spirit me off to Russia or something. But it's really unfortunate in retrospect, looking back, that I didn't get the opportunity to meet with the Russians at that time. Like I say, the Cold War was kind of warming up, and it might have been very interesting to get in the ground floor of that Chikatilo murder. The psychiatrist, Bukanovsky, told me in the early 90s that this is what was going on. They were trying to get some assistance, but they didn't quite know how to approach the FBI, so they just called, I'm sure that was on tape somewhere. You heard on the video that I had found out in my early days in dealing with Gacy that actually I lived 4 blocks down the street from John Wayne Gacy as a kid. And looking into his prison records and his police records, I found his address, and I couldn't believe it. I said, my God, this guy lived 4400 block. I lived in 4100 block of Marmora Avenue in Chicago. And looking further into it, he was a little bit younger than I, but we had traveled the same streets, played in the same parks, attended the same movie theaters. Actually, we were both in Boy Scout troops, and he was in one troop, I was in another troop, but we met in the same field house in the local park. And although I cannot actually remember laying eyes on him or talking to him in particular, I mean, he did grow up right down the street from me, being 5 years younger, four and a half years younger. Obviously, as a kid, you don't fool around with people who are that much younger. They're kids or 4 years older, the old guys. So I didn't have any contact that I recall, but he did recall delivering groceries to my house because of distinctive flower pots that were on the front of my house and my grandmother's house next door. So I told my mother this. I said, Gacy used to deliver groceries to our house, She said, my God, you told John Gacy where I lived, And I said, well, I don't live there anymore, Mom. It's really not a big thing. And she doesn't either. She moved not much after that. So my mother has always been a little leery of the way I've gone. For example, on Mother's Day of 1985, 1988 rather, on Mother's Day, I gave her for Mother's Day gift my first book, Sexual Homicide Patterns and Motives. She keeps that in the bottom drawer there in the bedroom somewhere. Doesn't show anybody. But the Gacy thing, it kind of really. I started on it when it actually went down. I was at the location. I was at the crime scenes. I worked with the police, Joe Kozenzak, the guy in the car talking. I worked with him, and Joe had attended my class at the FBI Academy. After the conviction, I did spend a lot of time with Gacy over years in jail trying to get him to come across. He went everywhere from confessing to most of the murders to confessing almost to none of them. He used to send me letters on stationery that said, execute justice, not people. And, was trying to convert me to more or less come to his appeal so that he wouldn't be executed. And, I was trying to bargain with him. If you come up with more homicides, maybe I can do something for you, but you're going to have to turn them over. I'm convinced that Gacy, in 5 years that these murders occurred, that he killed probably not 33, but more like 53 or more people, because he traveled to 14 different states throughout the United States. You saw that one pin map on the wall. That pin map was in his office, in his house, that showed 14 different states, and he had been in those states off and on remodeling jobs as part of his business. And there's just no way in the world that a person would do what he was doing in Chicago and not do it on the road. So I think he's killed far more than 33, and he never denied that he didn't. The video indicated he was executed on May 10th, 1994. Prior to that execution, I'd seen him in 92. In fact, when that video was made, the interview with him, I did that interview in his prison blue shirt, and it's actually a much longer interview. That's just a little piece of it. But I kept communication with him, and before the execution, he started believing he was going to be executed, and he had asked me to come to attend the execution, to witness the execution. I told him I really didn't care to see anybody executed. That's not, really my bag. I see enough death without witnessing it, as it's ongoing. So I declined several times. He wrote several times. He called my house a number of times. That used to freak my wife out all the time when he called the house. She'd say, John Gacy's on the phone for you. When he sent the painting, of course, that I suggested we hang it in our son's room, and she said, no, it's not in the house, But he started getting really kind of ticked off at me because I didn't want to see the execution. Felt I ought to be there, being neighborhood buddies and all. But I told him, no way, not going to happen. So his final words, he called, several days before the execution. He said, Bob, I'll tell you what, if you don't come and see me, witness the execution, he said, I'm going to come and see you after the execution. So I said, okay. I kind of passed that off, and that's the last time I spoke to him. May 10th, 1994, I was in Houston, Texas. It was right up the road here. And I was on some sort of a civil case working with attorneys, and I met with them in the afternoon. I had dinner with them in the evening. Went back to my room, probably somewhere around 10:30, 11 o'clock, and as I went in, I turned on the TV set, and flicked over to CNN, and they were doing the usual thing. They had the crowd, the pro-execution, the anti-execution crowds in front of the prison, carrying signs and chanting and doing all sorts of things. The news people were out there with the cameras and the mini cams and all that sort of thing, and they were, building up that Gacy's going to be executed somewhere around midnight. I watched that for a while, and I said, nah, I'm not going to watch this. Whatever happens, if it stayed, fine. If it's not, fine. I'll catch it in the morning. So I turned on a movie, kind of watching this movie, and not very interesting. I fell asleep on my bed, and I slept for a while, and I woke up with a real start. I mean, my chest was like heaving. I was perspiring, just really feeling bad. It felt like there was a huge pressure on my chest. Started, kind of hyperventilating, and kind of went staggering to the bathroom, took a drink of water, washed my face off, looked in the mirror, looked like hell, hair sticking up all over the place, I thought, what on earth, I thought, is this the end, dying in a motel room of a coronary or something? Because it was really, I had never woke up like that before, never really have, never since. And I kind of went staggering back into the bedroom. The movie was still on. I flicked over to CNN, and they announced that at the time that I woke up, because I looked right at the clock, next to the bed in the bedstand there, the time that I woke up, which is something like 1:15 or something, was the exact minute that Gacy was executed. And with this start that I had experienced, the only thing I can figure is he passed through Houston on the way to hell, just to say, just to fulfill his last promise that he was going to come and visit me. And I think he went right through, right in one side, not the other, because it's something I'd never experienced before. I hope I don't again. And it was pretty chilling. My hair was a lot darker than before that happened. So sometimes weird things happen. This vampire case, the one they portrayed here, Richard Chase. And that when I did in-depth interviews with Case after doing the profile, and the police said the profile helped them a lot. It didn't solve the case, but it gave them direction. To validate it, I did go to see Chase in prison, and he was bizarre. I mean, his eyes were all over the place. His eyes were like shark's eyes. If you saw the movie Jaws, the big shark comes out of the water, it's got these black, just marble eyes, no pupils. And that's what Case's eyes looked like. And he just kind of looked at you and looked through you, and he had leg irons and hand irons on and chains around his waist and everything else. He had described the fact that his blood was drying up, turning to powder, that moving slowly through his veins, that he was slowly losing his life, and to replenish his life he had to drink blood, bathe in blood, drink these blood solutions, and that was his explanation for why he was doing these awful murders. It really shocked the community because they were truly vampire murders. They were actual blood drinking. As I said, he did use the blenders. I think you saw the blenders up there. He had actually thrown in a heart and some liver and the blood. And, said it looked a lot like V8, which disappointed me because I used to love V8. And since then, I'm not too big on V8 anymore. Can't pop a can without thinking of Richard, But he was very psychotic. As I said, Gacy was a very organized offender, very organized sexual serial killer. Chase, on the other hand, was disorganized, highly disorganized, psychotic, mentally ill. He had alluded to the fact that he had a Star of David emblazoned on his forehead, which he pointed out to me during the interview. I didn't see it and wasn't there. And rather than argue with him about it, I just, said I didn't bring my reading glasses. I'm sure it was there, but I really didn't see it. He was full of delusions, hallucinations, and, really everybody's nightmare because you got the real man monster in your community, killing people, drinking their blood, cutting them to pieces. Prior to the 60s, entertainment was more or less action type, horror movies were limited to supernatural creatures. We used to focus back in the old days when I was a kid on Frankenstein, Wolfman, Dracula, the Mummy, the monsters, all the monsters. And it was frightening enough at that, but on towards the 60s, the early 60s, the mid 60s, and in particular one movie, Psycho, with Tony Perkins, who played Norman Bates, played in this film. Psycho And that was the break point. That really was the break point in this country, moving people's fears from mythical, supernatural beings to the man monster, the real monster. And it's, ironically, the escalation of man-monster cases from that time forward has just gone spiraled out of sight. So, like I say, as a kid, these creatures, used to frighten me, but you always knew there was no such thing. I mean, even when you went to bed after one of these movies and you laid in bed and through the darkness you saw the closet door was open. Oh, shit. You didn't want to get up. You didn't want to shut the closet. But you looked at it, and then you realized your arm was hanging over the side. Oh, gee. Pull that underneath the covers, and then you lay there until you fall asleep. But nothing like having a Richard Chase or a John Gacy living on your block. That's a whole other ballgame. I'll take some more questions. We'll take a short break, and then we'll finish up with a few more cases. Anybody else have a question? Yeah.
You've told us that you've done several interviews with the serial killers and several, I guess, of the well-known ones. And my question is, how easy was it to gain these interviews or be granted them? And then how did you go about doing it? What was the process? Okay.
As far as the doing the interviews with violent offenders in the penitentiaries, if I have any contribution I feel like I made to the FBI in my 20 years, I think that was it. Because prior to my involvement in this type of research, it was never done before. And as I indicated earlier, some of the higher-ups thought this was a pretty bizarre notion and the FBI shouldn't be delving this sort of thing. You ought to be out, locking people up. In fact, the Radish, as somebody had referred me to the Radish last hour, the Radish had indicated, he was pretty surly to me, and he said, well, Ressler, why do you think any incarcerated felon is going to tell you anything? You're the FBI, and, you're, essentially what he's saying, you're the good guy, they're the bad guy, and they won't talk to you. Well, that was a very naive perspective of a old-time FBI guy. These guys used to wear the hats and the wingtip shoes, and the concept there and his belief was almost like it came off of the movie screen, like, the bad guys don't talk to the good guys. In reality, once you study these people, once you look at them, once you look at their lives, and understand them, relating to them is not a problem, at least never was for me. One thing, I never did an interview with one of these people in prisons until I spent at least several months, and it was usually more like 4 or 5, 6 months, accumulating information, gathering intelligence on them. If in fact I wanted to do, say, a person like Gacy, I would have our Chicago FBI profiler, the guy who worked in the Chicago area, would go to the local police department. He would get the local police records on that individual or from the state. If there was a guy from the FBI National Academy who had been through my class in an area like Chicago, and there's a directory of these people from all over the country. I worked I think I worked 60, 65, or 66 National Academy classes, each one 3 months. So, I literally had made contact with thousands of police officers throughout the country. And there wasn't a place in the country where I couldn't call somebody from that directory, reintroduce myself or remember the guy and say, hey, how about this case, your local case? Can you get me some information on that case? So I had many resources to get information, and by gathering information, gathering facts, including newspaper accounts, I would be able then to know everything I needed to know to go in and talk to one of these characters. Once I went in to the prison, I would spend at least a half a day and sometimes longer studying the prison records, going through the prison records page by page and learning even more. So when I went in to talk to these people, I knew more about them for the most part than they knew about themselves. I had a 72-page protocol to record information for the data collection that I would more or less brief up on, but I wouldn't sit and fill it out as I talked to them. That would be done later because I knew basically what was in there, and what I would do is establish a rapport. And in law enforcement, you'll find that the very same rules apply just to doing interviews, interrogations, anytime you're dealing with people, the more you know about them, the better equipped you are to do that interview, be it to gather information, to gain a confession, and in my case, to gather information that would go into a data bank for compiling information on that individual. But I would find out their likes or dislikes or hobbies or interests, and oftentimes I would spend sometimes 2 or 3 hours, sometimes the first interview, before I'd go back in the next day, just laying the groundwork without even talking about their crime and eventually moving into it. And it was just a matter of developing rapport, showing interest in the individuals, and believe me, man's basic, the basic way to get along with somebody, to get along and meet somebody and be effective with them, is to know something about them. It's kind of flattering when you have facts, where you know facts about an individual, and it also prevents them from leading you down a trail you don't want to go, deceiving you, telling you lies, if you can put them back on track from time to time, but with knowledge. So basically that was it. I mean, I learned enough about them that going in and talk to them, I found oftentimes it was just like talking to a normal person until you got down to the nitty-gritty. Then it got a little eerie. This Richard Case, the vampire killer, was very eerie. He was never on a normal plane. Jeffrey Dahmer, when I talked to Dahmer, and I talked to him for 9 hours, Dahmer was very ordinary up until the time that he would start talking about his crimes, and he was very explicit and very factual, didn't hide anything. And Dahmer, when he started talking about drilling holes in the heads of his victims, injecting acid into their brains to turn them into sex zombies, at that point my hair got a little bit grayer yet. I used to have dark hair, really, a long time ago. And having sexual activity with dismembered and disemboweled corpses, things of that nature. I mean, it went from the normal so far into left field that, but at the same time, you have to maintain your decorum. You can't start going, that breaks rapport too, So I think that the thing is experience and just maintaining a rapport. Developing and maintaining that rapport, you can get anything you want out of these people. Yeah.
Do you have an opinion on who killed John Benet Ramsey?
Oh, yes.
Could you tell us?
Yeah. In fact, I thought if that question came up, I have a short clip of video that I thought I'd throw in. I've done, with the John Benet case, I've done considerable media consultation on that particular case. I have not taken any position with the police or with the family. I'm maintaining a real neutral stance on this one because of a number of reasons. But I have done television commentary on it, and my position is pretty specific. First of all, the ransom note. If I were, I try to put myself into the mind of the killer. I often do that when I'm doing a profile. In this case, I'd like to put myself into the mind of the police, because I cannot believe that if I were a police officer at the scene and they presented me with that note, that I would have bought that note. That note was the most bogus note that one can imagine. It was very, very artificial. It was phony from the word go. When you see the note and all that note said, when you see the crime scene as we know it was, nobody knows for sure because only what was related to by Ramsey himself, John Ramsey himself, and by the information that came out later from the police. Nobody knows what the crime scene was exactly, but what it was supposed to be, the note, the circumstances of the abduction of that child, you put it all together, and I would put it this way, if on a medical basis, a medical model, all that happened in the Ramsey case, it would be synonymous for, say, a doctor to say a patient died from tuberculosis, cancer, heart ailment, AIDS, syphilis, common cold, liver disease, in other words, it's such a mishmash and hodgepodge of behavioral circumstances at that crime scene that they could never come together the way they did. There's just too many conflicting dynamics. The note itself is as I say, totally bogus. There's no way that note could have been written by a pedophile, stranger pedophile, child killer, as now the Ramseys are indicating that there was some sort of a person like this roaming the neighborhoods. A pedophile does not break into a house to grab a kid out of a house and then kill the kid in the house while the parents are sleeping there. A kidnapper does not break into a house to kidnap a child, kill the child, which is the very basis of a kidnapping, is to take the child for ransom. So the kidnapper breaks in, takes the kid in the basement, kills the kid, which is the very way he's going to get money from the family, and then sit down and write a kidnap note after he's killed the child. The thing is bizarre. And as I say, there are so many conflicting dynamics that it's just, I won't point the finger at anybody. I've said over and over that I believe JonBenet Ramsey knew her killer. I believe the killer knew JonBenet Ramsey. I believe the note and the garrote around the neck and the rope on her arm, the whole thing, to possibly include the what appears to be sexual assault, I think is an elaborate scheme that was staged to conceal the true aspects of what really happened at that in that house that night. It's an elaborate smokescreen. The parents have built a wall around themselves during the investigation rather than cooperating with the police. They've built literally a barrier around themselves, shielding themselves from from cooperating or being investigated by the authorities. So it's a bizarre thing. I'll flick on this. I'm going to raise this screen, not use it again, so I think after the break. So what I'll do is I'll just put this at like 4 or 5 minutes. It kind of gives you an overview of that Ramsey. It's short and to the point.
Agent Robert Ressler has Colorado to do what the cops can't seem to and tell us what they won't. And his first insights into the JonBenet slaying are surprising and chilling.
The rambling 3-page note, the demand for $118,000, very specific number, the practice note. Kidnappers don't do this.
During the 45-minute drive to the foothills of the Rocky Mountains, Ressler seems anxious to start checking out his theories.
I'd like to see the residents. I want to see the physical residents. I want to see the community.
Then we're in Boulder and the neighborhood where JonBenet used to play.
All in all, it looks more secure than the other homes in the neighborhood.
He discovers something we've never heard about until now.
There's an entrance that could go into the basement window here. This is really interesting. Certainly somebody could get down there and kick in a window.
And checking out the back of the house, our investigator spots something else. A clear vantage point inside JonBenet's playroom from a tree outside.
Somebody could conceivably be able to view the child's room.
During the course of his investigation, he swaps notes with veteran reporter Charlie Brennan of Denver's Rocky Mountain News.
A little cool here. Need a cup of coffee?
Ressler gets a day-by-day account of the murder case, trying to put together the pieces of the puzzle.
It's the kind of neighborhood where anybody who didn't belong would stand out.
Back at his hotel, he calls Boulder County Coroner John Mayer, who was not able to talk about the case. And before the day is over, our investigator wants to make one more trip to the Ramsey home. But this time, he wants to see the house the way the killer saw it, at night.
Whoever came to this house on the night of murder was an individual who probably knew about this house, who had been in the house before, who was familiar with this neighborhood, and knew exactly why, what and why they were entering this house on that particular night.
The next morning, Robert Ressler pays a visit to the police. Then he walks around Boulder talking to whomever can provide him information on the Ramsey case.
It's a pretty quiet neighborhood right here.
Yeah, we're on the hill here.
Including family friend Pamela Griffin and her daughter Christine.
How about the state of mind? How's Mrs. Ramsey handling this last time you saw her?
She was completely devastated and destroyed.
Do you think the killer may have had any contact with the Pagents? I mean, showing up, do you think the Pagents have anything to do with the crime?
No, because JonBenet was not the only beautiful, talented pageant child. in the country. There are hundreds of them.
It's now been 48 hours of intensive investigation, but the probing look at the house, the long talks with neighbors, the myriad of phone calls, and the examination of all the facts has now paid off for our profiler. Now his startling conclusions. Ressler is convinced little John Bonet knew her killer, and there's more.
I think the note, I think the garrote, I think the tying of the child, all of this was done in a panicked effort to conceal the true facts of that murder. Whoever killed this child did not intend to kill the child, and when in fact the child was killed, they went through an elaborate scheme to throw up a number of clouds to really conceal what had actually happened, because what actually happened might be too revealing as to who actually killed this child. I believe she was killed by accident. I don't think she was killed intentionally. I don't think she was killed as part of a sex game. I don't think the garrote was used to, whoever came up with that concept is not very aware of the ins and outs of sexual asphyxia. You do not, the practitioner constricts the neck, not that of his victim, unless, of course, it's a sadistic type of individual. Again, that is not feasible in this particular case. It's a real hodgepodge. And I won't say what I really think, because I don't think it's appropriate for me to do so. But that which I have said, I think suffices. It's an elaborate scheme to throw up a smoke screen and a wall around the true nature. And the person that wrote the note didn't necessarily kill the child. So it's it's a little bit of a puzzle.
Hey, Bob, some of the students one day asked me, I know you said it, I said it, and others when we were on the task force, that these serial killers, don't stop. And yet a couple of the students have asked me about the Green River killer case, as well as the BTK case in Wichita.
Yeah.
Do we have any additional information over the past few years? Is there any other leads on that, or is it still where? Are both those cases still where they're at? We just simply don't know.
Well, Green River murders, I'm still, in close contact with Bob Keppel, Bob. And Keppel was one of the key people on that case. And the case has really kind of come to a screeching halt. They had three very, very good suspects, one of which some of the people on task force still think is the guy. Bob Keppel has come out with two books recently within the last couple of years. One called Riverman by Robert Keppel, and Keppel. And the other one just came out very recently, and I don't remember the name of it, but it's another book, new book by Bob Keppel. And he talks about Green River, talks about the Bundy cases, the Bundy case in great depth. I don't think Green River has really gone anywhere. BTK, I was out there in Kansas on one occasion, and I guess it's no longer a big secret, but we came up with a scenario to attempt to set a trap for the BTK killer, and I thought the BTK killer was definitely linked to the university in was it Manhattan, Kansas, right?
Yeah, it was Kansas State.
Kansas, no, it wasn't Kansas City.
No, Kansas State, wasn't it?
Yeah, Kansas State. I thought it might have been a graduate student or a faculty member. And in fact, there were good reasons for thinking that, but I mean, it dried up so bad and it's so old now. But I'll tell you, I was out there at Kansas State a while back lecturing to the student body, and somebody came up to me in class and had information about a relative of hers that she said she always thought was a BTK, and he was in prison and was due to get out, and I turned her over to the local police. I don't know where that went. But some of these cases, just one day they'll just pop up just like that one. I was really holding out my hope that could have been the solution, but I haven't heard back from the Kansas. That wasn't too long ago either. Yeah, two big mysteries, BTK, bind them, torture them, kill them. Wanted to be like David Berkowitz, wanted to have a logo, And of course, the ego of these people oftentimes will generate that. I'll tell you, just recently, where you see the copycat aspects of these cases. I was in Japan not too long ago, and they had a case there of a 11-year-old kid whose head, he was decapitated, and his head was found on the steps of the schoolyard, right on the steps, entrance to the school. And the eyes had been gouged out. The head was sitting there facing out. As you would be coming up the steps, you'd see the head looking at you. And within a few days, letters were started coming into the police and to the media with all sorts of bizarre statements on the letter, and it was signed "The School Killer," written in English. School Killer. School was spelled wrong. I think it was SKOOL. The School Killer, and in fact there was a logo that was designed, that was going to be his logo. Well, when you got into the letters, and the letters of course were in Japanese, they had to be translated, but I got into the letters, and there were excerpts in the letters that came clearly from the Zodiac Killer, and in fact there is a book in Japan on the Zodiac Killer. It recently has been released in Japanese, in the Zodiac, the one from San Francisco back in the 70s. There were lines in there: "The police will never catch me, they're too stupid. Now," he says, "now let the games begin. Now the killing will start." And there were excerpts that came from the Zodiac Killers and also from David Berkowitz, the Son of Sam Killer. There are a couple other things in there that link to different famous U.S. cases, and they were looking for a guy in his 30s, late 30s and mid 30s, early 40s, that there had been seen hanging around this school who drove a certain dark car. I got into this thing and I said that this is a kid that did this, and it's a kid who's probably mid to late adolescence. I said he either attends the school or attended the school, possibly kicked out because of disruptive behavior or whatever, troublesome type kid. And it wasn't a couple weeks and they had a 14-year-old kid in custody who had been kicked out of the school. He was 2 months from graduation. It was like a middle school, and he was told to stay home. Told the parents, keep the kid home till graduation. He's causing too much trouble. And they found all sorts of books in his house on, American crimes. So even in Japan, you're getting some very bizarre crimes. Japan was a crime-free society up until just recently. Yeah.
It seems, I don't know how to turn, it seems a good time to ask, since you mentioned the childhood, and what have you found, or what advice would you have as far as prevention? Every time I see one of these heinous, particularly the serial killer or the serial sexual type killings, I can't help but wonder what could have been done earlier in this person's life to prevent this cycle from exacerbating. Do you have anything on that?
I don't have any answers, but I made reference to the book that I work with my colleagues, Sexual Homicide Patterns and Motives, and that did go into the childhood, experiences of these offenders, and there was a good deal of information that was pulled together that would support certain things going astray in childhood to be looked at more carefully. As I said, one of the chapters is Growing Up to Murder, and it covers behavior patterns, nightmares, night terrors, various forms of aberrant, behavior. And one chapter is a chapter on a motivational model of a person that commits these types of crimes, that runs around a model that starts in childhood. I've often said I think that there's enough information that not anybody like myself, but somebody who's really specializing in child psychology to deal, abnormal child psychology, to deal with a troublesome kid, where I think you could make some dents in future future crimes if in fact a focus would be on the disturbed child in the elementary schools. We have in the last couple of years we've heard a lot about the 100,000 police officers on the street program, the crime bill, $31 billion to put 100,000 police officers on the street. Well, this is like putting a Band-Aid on a spurting arterial wound. 100,000 police officers in Washington, D.C., I doubt would even curb the crime that's going on there. If you've been reading about this lately, they've got police officers on the detective force that are bringing down $100,000 a year in overtime pay, and that's addition to the salary, okay? Not bad, overtime. And they're not solving any homicide cases. So police officers on the street, more prisons, death sentence, these are all things that have virtually no impact on controlling crime. I would say if they would put 100,000 child psychologists in the elementary schools, where most school systems can't afford a psychologist on their staff, to deal with disturbed kids in the elementary grades, I think, and get them on track before they get too far off, I think you'd see a big payoff in years to come. The problem is the political scene in Washington. Nobody in Washington is interested in what's going to happen in 15 years. They want it within their own administration. So a program like that will just fall on deaf ears. But realistically, that's where you could really get into crime prevention, by getting psychologists and counselors in the elementary schools on a not contract or, one for an entire school system, one in each school, and to identify. Every teacher knows. My wife was a teacher. Every elementary school teacher can tell you the kids that they've had over the years that are going to be in big time trouble. They'll tell you every time. No surprise. Oh yeah, Charlie, shotgunned 6 people last week. He was in my class in 3rd grade. I knew he was going that way. I mean, teachers can identify kids on a day-to-day basis that are having problems. A good counselor you can change patterns when a kid is 6, 7, 8, 9 years of age. When a kid is 12, 14, 16, 18, forget it. Too late. Die is cast. So I think that's the answer, is really intensive work with very young elementary school kids before they get so far into their bizarre fantasies. I had one case, in my book, Whoever Fights Monsters, the Chapter 5, Death of the Newsboy. This guy had murdered a little boy of 11 years when he was about 16, 17, and by the time he was 18, he murdered 2 more 12, 14-year-olds. Actually consumed their flesh, bit their bodies, consumed their flesh, murdered them. And this guy, when I interviewed him in prison, I did the profile that worked with the police to catch this guy. Then I interviewed him in prison like I did Case. In prison, he told me that as a kid of 6 and 7 years of age, he could vividly recall when the babysitter came to his house to sit with him. He vividly recalled going up to the babysitter, touching the flesh on her neck and stroking her hair, and in his pocket of his bathrobe he would have a table knife, that he would be feeling the knife and fantasizing as a 6, 7-year-old stabbing this woman and killing her, this babysitter, while he felt her flesh, and then afterward he would consume her flesh. That was all in his fantasy. And he said he would have a table knife, a butter knife in his pocket. And I said, John, why the butter knife? Why the table knife? I said, why don't you get a steak knife, something to increase that fantasy? He said, well, my mom told me never to touch sharp knives. So you get the combination of the innocent child that won't touch a sharp knife, but he's having thoughts of killing and consuming the flesh of his babysitter. He went on to do that. And I think Joubert himself, John Joubert, who's now executed, he was executed a couple of years ago, he told me, he said, had anybody really looked at him when he was a kid, 6, 8, 9, 10 years of age, he said they would have seen a disturbed child. He knew he was disturbed. He just didn't know how to relate that. Yeah.
Yeah, Mr. Ressler, you mentioned earlier about the Zodiac killer. I specifically wanted to ask you if you ever had an opportunity to work with those case files. And to my understanding, I know he was never caught. If there was any lead as to who it may have been and why the killing stopped.
Yeah, Zodiac killer was. We did fool around with that one in behavioral science and tried our best to help the police on that one. It was never solved, like you said. We had some ideas on that, which we, imparted to the police. It dried up and blew away for many years. It fired up again when Zodiac letters started coming back to the police and to the media again, and that was. Well, really, it was many years after they stopped, and it took a weird twist there because the Zodiac was saying that he would never be caught, that he was going to start killing again, and not even the detective, the master detective who was working the case, the best detective in the country, couldn't even catch him. Well, he got into the thing a little deeper. The detective himself, who was in the media a lot when the Zodiac thing was active, was now feeling the depression of being out of the news, and he started writing Zodiac letters himself to bring attention back to himself. And he was put on a psychiatric counseling program. But apparently he kind of stepped into the abyss there. And but the Zodiac dried up, never happened. A New York Zodiac showed up a few years ago. It was not the same one. I don't know if we'll ever know. My thoughts on Zodiac is that the guy was actually incarcerated, probably mentally ill in mental institution or prison, and people just don't know what they've gotten there, you know. But it just has never been solved. One of those. I always say there's no such thing as a perfect crime, but there is such a thing as imperfect investigation, and I think that's really where the future lay right in this class, you know, to grab up some of these forensic advances and move into this field and, become more perfect in investigation. Over here. Bye. Okay.
I was wondering how your career has affected you psychologically.
How has it affected?
It's affected him a lot.
Well, I'm perfectly normal, as you can see. I would say if you check with my wife and my mother and ask them what they think, they'd probably come up with a better assessment. But I think I've maintained a fair balance. You know, I haven't experienced some of the stress factors that some of my colleagues have in years past. I've had people that I have worked with that, number one, some just quit because they didn't want to be in this anymore. They just asked for other assignments in the FBI, just outright quit. Several in our unit ended up with some psychosomatic disorders, which were wrongly diagnosed as ulcers or some sort of gastric type problem, which in fact was psychosomatic. Nobody really had ulcers. One guy had a mock heart attack at one time, which they took him in and checked him out, and there was no heart attack. One guy lost about 40 pounds over a period of months, and when he went to see his doctor, the doctor just told him to get a different job. So another guy went kind of goofy when he started getting overly involved with a serial killer that he was dealing with in prison, started feeling sorry for him and really being manipulated by that individual. So I have seen some of my colleagues develop some cracks. I don't think I've developed any yet. Just wait for the big one, huh? Yeah. One more and then we'll take the break.
Yes, Mr. Ressler, you mentioned a moment ago about interceding on young children that can be identified to be as having potential problems in the future. We're very close to being able to scientifically identify young children that are going to be potential violent offenders in the future. How would you balance stepping in with those youngsters, also with their civil liberties, and subjecting them to various sorts of preventative treatment whenever it's against their will?
Yeah, sure, that's the big one. I think identifying problems in the classroom and dealing with them through referrals, through social services or whatever would be acceptable, especially when a kid's coming to school with bruises, with obviously abused, kid who is disruptive in the classroom, doing things like killing the classroom project, maybe a guinea pig or something like that. When you get something solid, like I say, identifying, referring to social services is one thing. Stigmatizing by saying that this kid fits a pattern of a future, homicidal personality, nobody's going to stand still for that one, obviously. So it would have to be done delicately. It would have to be done along the lines of maintaining a decorum within the classroom, because some kids are very disruptive, and to help the child. Like I say, one of the biggest problems, of course, is the family. If the family is not willing to accept the help, it makes the whole thing kind of futile. So the family would have to be cooperative, and oftentimes the family is the problem itself. Civil libertarians, of course, ACLU, stuff like that, they'd go berserko if you ever came up with a program that seemed to identify future serial killers. I mean, they would really... the whole research, for those of you with criminology backgrounds back in the 70s or earlier than that, when the XYY theory came about, the XYY criminal, the abnormal chromosomes, there was a Boston study within the Boston City hospitals to identify XYY children, in the hospitals at birth, and to track them and trace them and see what, to watch them. And once civil libertarians got a hold of that one, they stopped it real fast because they figured it was stigmatizing these kids. So sometimes, the liberties and all, impede in, advances in research. But then again, that's the game we play, I guess. Yeah. Going to take a 5-minute break? Short one. Okay. I'll just wrap it up then, and then we'll sign a few books, have a few drinks. I had a rather strange experience just the other day, 2 weeks ago, actually. I got a call from an attorney, and a young man named Ricky Lee Green was to be executed on the 8th of October of this year, just a couple weeks ago. And she stated Ricky wanted to talk to me and to communicate with me prior to his execution. I testified against Ricky Green in the penalty phase when, in fact, he was convicted of a series of homicides up in Tarrant County. And that was back in the early 90s. And Texas moves quickly. It took 13 years for Gacy, 9, 10 for Bundy. Tarrant, I think it must have been 92 when I testified in the sentencing phase and in support of the state. And although I'm not a advocate for the death sentence, I mean, I'm not a real firm believer in the death sentence, neither do I disbelieve it. My main objection to the death sentence in this country is it's more or less used as a political lever, and politicians will make platforms off it. They'll show they're tough on crime with the death sentence. But in reality, anybody in criminology knows that the death sentence does not deter violent crime. In fact, that's one of the questions I would ask these inmates is that would, in fact, the death sentence in your state have deterred you from your crimes? The reality is these people are impulse-driven, they're emotion-driven. There's no way in the world they even think about what's going to happen to them because they don't believe they're ever going to be caught anyhow. So the death sentence is ineffectual. It's too expensive. That's one of my main complaints is that, like a guy with Gacy, 13 years, 3-4 different appeals, it takes literally about $1 million a year to keep these guys, afloat when, in fact, they are finally executed. A guy like Gacy, you're talking about $12, $13, $14 million. It's the state's tax money to play out these games, and like I say, they're just kind of foolish. Green, I said he was right here in Huntsville. Was he not in Huntsville, Doug? Yeah. And I was going to be here today, and I said, I told the attorney, can he wait till the 16th? I'm going to be here. And she said, no, he doesn't think it's going to be stayed, that he probably will be executed. And I said, well, I had a slew of commitments. There's no way in the world I could have come here. I said, I want you to contact him and let me know, does he have other murders to talk about? Does he want to talk about something new? Because if he did, I said I would make it, I'd get here, even though it caused me all sorts of havoc. And he called back, said it didn't have anything to do with any new murders, but he needed to talk to me. I said, well, you better tell him, put it in writing, because I said I cannot make it. I would have to cancel literally contracts and that sort of thing to come, so I just couldn't make it. I'm very curious. He didn't offer any options like Gacy as far as coming to visit me after the execution, so I wasn't too concerned. But of course I am curious, and I would love to have come. It was really funny because, I testified, my testimony probably hurt him as much as anything in the receiving the death sentence. It was really strange because I was sitting out in the, after I testified, I was sitting out in the observers area in the courtroom, and after he had received the death sentence, the bailiff came up, put the handcuffs on, and he came walking, to lead him out to the outer area. And when he came to where I was sitting, he stopped and he just turned and looked right at me, handcuffs, looking me right in the eye, maybe about that far away. And he just looked at me for a second, and the bailiff kind of pushed his arm, and he just stood there, and then he broke into a big smile, and he shook his head and smiled at me and nodded at me, kind of affirmative nodding. And of course the media who was in the courtroom, they converged on me afterwards. Oh, what was he doing? What did he say? Was he threatening you? Was he going to get you or something? I said, hey, he's going to get me. He's in prison. He's got the death sentence. I really interpreted that as that he was acknowledging that everything I said was accurate. And I think he was, in a sense, telling me, you pegged me pretty close, and I think that's what he probably wanted to talk about. Never know for sure, but unless he did reduce it to writing. But like I say, sometimes you get this tie with these people gets a little bizarre from time to time. Ricky Lee Green. If we can flick, we get the slides back on here. Kind of end up here. I'll just get kind of one of the things in the introduction that was mentioned, that many of the things that I have done myself and my colleagues in the behavioral science unit has now found its way to the silver screen in movies like Silence of the Lambs. Tom Harris did come to the FBI when, in fact, he was researching his book, The Red Dragon, which became a movie called The Manhunter. And that's where Hannibal Lecter was originally created, in the Red Dragon, before Silence of the Lambs was even, thought of. I personally thought The Red Dragon was a better book, and even the movie itself wasn't all that great, but I thought the book was better than Silence of the Lambs. After that came out, Harris came back, and he did, in fact, again seek information on and I did consult on Silence of the Lambs as well. In the FBI, they have a publicity department. People can come in and they can, request things like this. I want to talk to somebody about profiling, and they will refer them, and that happens all the time. Copycat, the movie Copycat. I did consult the movie Copycat. Billy McNamara, the guy who played the serial killer, not the one in jail, but the actual killer. I spent a day with him, instructing him on the finer points on serial homicide. I didn't think that he did a really great job in the movie, but Profiler, Profiler, I'm a technical consultant now to Profiler. I'm trying to put it back on track, get away from the psychic flashing. The Academy Group, in that film, the Academy Group, they said, is in Manassas. A lot of my former colleagues are in the Academy Group. They are consulting to the Millennium series. And the X-Files, Chris Carter, the writer, has used a lot of my material from, in particular, Whoever Fights Monsters, in some of the earlier X-Files, and some lately as well. There was one that really gave me a kick, and I don't watch it that often, but I watched this one because my daughter watched it, and she saw it and told me to watch it as well. I think, she copied it for me, that's how I saw it, where the Mulder, or whatever his name is supposed to be a former behavioral science unit guy. He gets on a case, and his old boss, the head of the behavioral science unit, comes out and gives him a bad time. And at the end of that segment, the boss of the behavioral science unit is a serial killer. And Mulder catches him, I guess. So. And in the thing, at the end, they say, well, he fell into the abyss, he became a monster, and they start going off the Nietzsche quote. So a lot of this stuff has really come from, and it's complimentary in a sense, because they're taking, they're taking life and they're turning it into art, if you want to call this art. But all too often, art will, imitate life as well, and you'll start, getting spillovers, and copycat cases will occur. Like I say, the kid in Japan got really wrapped up in this stuff to the point where he, at 14 years of age, this guy does this, which, like I say, has really shocked the Japanese. My first question was, were there any similar acts in the area? Because something this dramatic, taking a head of a kid and putting it on the sidewalk and, writing notes, I said he had to build up to that. That couldn't have been a first crime. Well, yeah, there had been 2 assaults on young girls in a nearby neighborhood, both with iron bars, hitting these young girls, 11, 12 years of age, with iron bars, and one died of the injuries. And the police didn't equate that at all. Not to say Japanese police aren't good, they're very good, but Japanese police have so little experience in this type of stuff. They are terrible in homicide. They send their Japanese doctors to New York hospitals so they can learn about gunshots and knife wounds. They don't see enough in Japan. So the police just don't see these things, and there had to be an escalation of building up, and sure enough, it turned out that this kid did confess to practicing. He said practicing for the big one by going out and whacking these girls. Also, I said animals in the area. Sure enough, there were a bunch of pets and animals that had been murdered, killed in the community over a period where this guy was building up to this school killing thing. But the one that is this one here, the Plainfield, Wisconsin case, is one that became the basis of the film Psycho. I'd mentioned the film Psycho, which really kind of set the stage for the break from the fictional monster, the supernatural monster, and kind of bridged into the modern day of man monsters, and that was the film Psycho. The film Psycho was based on this case in Plainfield, Wisconsin, and in fact, when I consulted with Tom Harris on Silence of the Lambs, I also showed him this particular case. And Buffalo Bill, if you recall, was the killer who was taking women's skins to turn into some sort of transformation, transforming himself in some way to becoming a woman himself. And that is exactly what happened in the Ed Gein case. Ed was a guy who was a farmer, lived on a farm, wasn't much of a farmer himself. He had grown up on a farm, but his parents had run this small farm in Plainfield, and in fact this guy was disturbed as a young person. He almost the case that I made earlier, had somebody been on to this guy when he was a kid, demonstrating all these bizarre actions in elementary school, perhaps he would have been treated and this would have never happened. The family was embarrassed at his mental illness. He had been kicked out of school for being, he really suffering from childhood schizophrenia, never treated, kept at home, and just worked around the farm. It was a small farm. He never really got out into the community after that. Grew up with mom, dad, and his older brother. His older brother kind of kept an eye on him along with mom and dad. The older brother died in a farming accident, suffocated in a field fire. Later, Dad passed away, leaving only Mother, and Mother kept a close track of him as possible. He was up in his mid to late 50s. Looks a lot older there, but Mom died, leaving him to his own designs. Well, now in his mid to late 50s, the guy is kind of on the farm. He's an adult. He's not, all there, but he's been in and out of town from time to time, picking up groceries and stuff with Mom. Now he's off to his own designs, and he is known in the community because the community used to, knowing he was kind of a lonely old guy, they would drop their kids off with him and let him babysit, on weekends, things of that nature. And he'd be seen with half a dozen kids playing hide and go seek and, on the farm. And he'd take care of them and make a few bucks that way. Well, one day things kind of turned around because, in fact, the word in the stores where this thing broke, several women had disappeared in the town, and they were rather perplexed because this is a very small community in Wisconsin, rural Wisconsin. Several women disappearing, and now one day the woman, Mrs. Warden, that owned the store, was in there most of the day, and when one customer came in, she wasn't there, and there was blood on the floor, so she called the police, and the police came to the scene, found blood on the floor, and Mrs. Warden was missing. In the store, on the counter, there was a notepad that stated Ed Gein had been in the store and had purchased a gallon of antifreeze. The notepad, this is, mind you, back in the 50s when they didn't have all the computerized, cash registers and stuff. Just a notepad with Ed Gein 1 gallon antifreeze. So they figured add the date on it, that day. They figured he had been in the store, so they went out to his farm to see if he had any information that might be useful, because there was blood on the floor, there were drag marks, indicating that a body had been drug out the back door, and then there were tire tracks. And they really went out with the thought that he might be a witness rather than suspecting him of anything. When they went out there, they couldn't find him. They went around, looked around the place, eventually entered the house. The room, which was Mother's room, was more or less maintained pretty well, intact and very clean and very orderly. He had nailed up her room, and had been boarded up for years since her death, kind of enshrined her room. The rest of the place, on the other hand, was kind of a mess. The rest of the house was very dirty, disheveled. His own bed was just a pile of dirty, filthy bed clothing and dirty clothes on the floor. He had two piles, dirty and dirtier, and he would kind of alternate, rarely washing his clothes. And he was very much alone in this farm. They started finding things in the house that were a little bit unusual, and in fact, when they got out to the outbuilding, they found a box with several skull caps, what appeared to be human skull caps, and other body parts, bones and that sort of thing were found, and they started to become a little bit alarmed at that point. Looking around the outbuilding, they found a winch leading to the ceiling, and hanging from that winch was the cadaver, the corpse of Mrs. Worden. She had been taken from the hardware store. She was killed or shot. She was actually shot in the store with a gun taken right from the rack, the gun rack, and a bullet taken from the shelf. He didn't bring a weapon with him. He just took what was on the shelf, and now he was hanging her up and was in the process of skinning her body up and down, and from the front she was completely opened up. Her internal organs were on the floor, and inside the house they found a number of skull masks, actual human masks taken from skulls, peeled away, and preserved with motor oil. There was a half a dozen of these things, along with clothing made from human flesh, cloaks and belts and things of that nature. And essentially this guy was creating a woman's body, which he wore. From time to time he would put these masks on over his own head. He would put the clothing on, and he'd kind of prance around the house there. So the Buffalo Bill thing and the psycho themes really had strong ties to this. But even more bizarre, this guy was actually taking human heads, and you can see the kind of shiny bronze surface there and the skin. He would rub these things down with motor oil to keep them soft and supple so they wouldn't crack. And Pennzoil 1030, but they've never used that in their promotional advertising. So essentially that was the Gein case. Want to hit the lights again? All right, well, I'll tell you, let's leave them off. Let me quickly go through a couple cases here, and then we'll kind of wrap it up. This is just the one case where I mentioned in my book, Whoever Fights Monsters, of the first case that I had really ever profiled in, a guy by the name of David Meyerhofer. It was a case where a young girl was kidnapped from a tent in Bozeman, Montana. A hole was cut in the tent. The child was taken out. Myself and my colleagues in the Behavioral Science Unit back in 74, 75 profiled this to the point where a guy was caught, and his name was David Meyerhofer, and in fact it became a dilemma because he had passed a polygraph test and more or less sailed through interrogations, and they felt that he was the guy, but they couldn't prove it. Like I say, they did subject him to the polygraph. The agent out there felt that this guy was definitely the guy, but he was just passing all the tests, We suggested they do a search if they could do it. They've got a reason to search his ranch, and we told them to look for specific souvenirs of the crime. Serial killers do tend to, collect souvenirs. We recognized that back at the time. We said, look at everything, open up every drawer, look at every page of every book. You've got to find something that's going to help you. If you don't get it, you're going to lose this guy. So in looking through the house, they got into the freezer and they saw a package that said Deer Burger on the package, and they were really kind of going to pass by this. They thought it was just a package of, freezer full of meat, which you find on a ranch. One of the police officers said, hey, SMDS, he said, we had a missing young woman here about a year ago named Sandra Marie Dykeman Smallagin. So they opened the package, and in the package were the hands of Sandra Marie Dykeman Smallagin. And that pretty much led to the what would have been the conviction of David Meyerhofer, but in fact he did commit suicide. The little girl's head was found in the outhouse, down in the outhouse, and in fact he was the killer, but he did commit suicide. Here's Richard Chase, the vampire killer. That was the one in the film. There is the house where the first murder occurred, and the bathtub full of bloody water, which they talked about in the film. He had actually taken the baby, 21-month-old boy, butchered him in the bathtub, filled the bathtub full of water, took the kid's body out, wrapped it in a blanket, and bathed in the blood solution to absorb the blood into his body. He said he'd learned in high school biology that through osmosis that plants could absorb nourishment. He thought he could do that in the bloodied bath water, replenish his blood supply. Really a screwy guy. And of course the blenders which were found where he had made this blood solution. Another case I had, which is again we talk about vampires, cannibals as well. This guy in Midwest City, Oklahoma, was found to have killed his father. He was mentally ill and consumed about 40% of his father's body. This was the arms and shoulders, the heads, and it was down in the lower part of the refrigerator. And it literally, after killing his father, just subsisted off the old man by eating the father until he was caught. He probably would have finished him if he had not been caught. David Berkowitz, the son of Sam Killer, of course, held New York for a period of time, one of the earlier serial killers that was identified. And Berkowitz, like a lot of these guys, I interviewed him at length. And the thing is that I think it's a really great picture here because the smile on Berkowitz's face. And a lot of these guys, John Hinckley, I saw the same thing. I attended court with Hinckley when Hinckley was being prosecuted for shooting President Reagan. Wayne Williams, the Atlanta child killer, all of these guys in the courtroom, John Gacy the same way, they get very, very egocentric, during the trial. And of course people like Jeffrey Dahmer, whose pictures are in the front of Time magazine and stuff. I mean, this kind of appeals, they become infamous rather than famous, and it appeals to their personalities. And at the time of trial, oftentimes these people are in seventh heaven. Berkowitz, I mentioned, had developed a logo, Son of Sam, and developed a logo. The BTK Strangler had actually requested the media publish his logo, BTK, and to call him the BTK Strangler. The kid in Japan wanted to be known as a school killer. Zodiac had his Zodiac sign. So again, it's a matter of an inadequate person seeking identity, almost the way you see you'll see this in young children, really, sometimes 5, 6, 7, 4, even 3 or 4 years of age. A very disruptive kid, will do actually bad things to seek attention, even if it means a spanking's coming. But they will get that they're really crying for attention. You see the same basis here on an adult level. Berkowitz said that he couldn't wait, in a sense, although he didn't want to turn himself in. He said he couldn't wait till the day that the world knew that he was the Son of Sam Killer. He said it was, something that he fantasized about. Edmund Kemper, I talk about this guy in my book, Whoever Fights Monsters, and Kemper was a guy who was a giant of a man. Here he is pointing out a body site to the police, and in fact he had killed 11 young women, and ending up with his mother and a neighbor. Killed his grandparents at just 14 years of age, killed his grandparents, was put away in jail for a number of years and then released back to society when he did kill another 9 women, including his mother and a neighbor, but mainly focusing on young college women in the Bay Area of San Francisco. And this guy, really, that was head underneath the window ledge of his mother's window. But you can see Kemper here. See kind of off the screen just wrinkled. But this guy was 6 feet 9 and weighed 300 pounds. And a giant of a man. He had an IQ of about 145. an individual that probably I came closest to getting in trouble with, because I interviewed him the first time with 2 agents, second time with one and myself, and the third time I interviewed him alone, and then he started getting cute and talking about breaking my neck and, snapping my neck like a twig, but later indicated he was just kidding. Which I said, of course, I knew that all the time. Yeah.
Who's the guy on the left there with the brown?
I think it's another inmate there in the prison. It's another maniac. Bringing us to Jeffrey Dahmer, and of course Dahmer will kind of end up with him. But Jeff Dahmer, like I say, the one of the things that is unfortunate in our society is that we tend to give these people a little too much publicity, a little too much, TV time and headlines, and really for Dahmer to be on the cover of People magazine, and I think he was on People twice, I'm not mistaken, which is supposed to be the most interesting people in the country. That's their claim to fame, that they write articles about the most interesting people. Here's a guy that killed 17 people, and now he's held up as some sort of a interesting person. Time magazine, I think Berkowitz was on the cover of Newsweek. In other words, a very sick mind can almost be instigated into violent acts with the thought of gaining that notoriety. And short-lived as it may be, to a very inadequate person, it could be an incentive. And like I say, I think we give these people a little too much time in the media. It's kind of a good news, bad news picture here. The bad news, I'm having lunch with Jeffrey Dahmer. Knowing his eating habits, of course, this guy did kill 17 young men. He consumed a great deal of their flesh. And I discussed that with him, and he said he preferred the biceps, he really was after the biceps. Brains, he said, were just absolutely awful. I asked him if he ever drank blood, and he got mad at me. He said, "Mr. Ressler, you think I'm really sick, don't you?" I said, "No, I didn't drink blood." He said, "I did try it once, but I didn't like it, But this guy was into necrophilia. He was into I went through 500 photographs, most of which he took, some of which the police took, and I tell you, it was enough to blow your mind, the stuff that this guy was into. The dismemberments, the eviscerations, the way he methodically, when he was done with the victim, he'd stay up all night just slicing flesh and flushing it, and he'd slice the flesh away from the bones and keep the stuff that he wanted for his own cooking, but the rest of it was just flesh. He would just take a human being and flush him down the john piece by piece until there was very little left. And then he would take the bones, and he had these acid pots in his bedroom. He'd take the bones and stick them in there, get the acid off the bones, and then keep the bones, try to recreate skeletons, which he wanted to use for some sort of a power center that he was going to create with skeletons and bones and skulls. And the guy was into every weird thing, to include his ultimate experiment of drilling holes in the heads of 5 victims, injecting acid into their brains in an attempt to kill their intellect and to keep their bodies alive and nourished so he could keep them on forever as a sex zombie, I asked him, "Jeff, where'd you get that idea? Did you read it? Did you hear about it? Are you in a satanic cult? What's going on here?" He said, "It just came to me. I think it could work." And, the idea would be that he'd have a zombie, a sex zombie, that would be his for himself, keeping it in the home, and he'd just have a permanent, roommate. And I said, "Well, there are other ways of doing that without drilling holes in people's heads. Didn't you ever think that was unacceptable?" And he said, "Well, I knew that people wouldn't approve of it." He said, "But I thought it would work." Well, he was found guilty, and mentally sane in the courts in Wisconsin. They don't have a death penalty there, so he didn't get the death penalty, but he was found sane in the courtroom. And I think the dilemma with that type of case is I think psychiatry just has not come to the level of thoroughly understanding people like this that do these types of crimes. Psychiatry is more or less based on what I would call normally mentally ill people, if there's such a thing. But the criminally insane, I don't think psychiatry has a very good handle. And again, for those of you that are interested in pursuing forensic fields in the area of psychology or going on into medical school and eventually psychiatry, this is a field that there's a lot of work to do in this arena. Ed Kemper, the big guy that I just talked about, I think put it all in really good words one time when I was interviewing him. I had asked him specifically what he thought about his own state of mind. And Kemper, when he was in prison the second time, he was working in the psychological section of the prison where he was like a clerk in the psychology section. He was helping the psychologist, file and things of that nature, just doing administrative work, but he was reading a lot of the literature, and I asked him if he was familiar with the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual of Mental Disorders. He said he was, and back then when I interviewed him back in the 70s, it was called the DSM-2. It was in the second edition. Now it's in the fourth edition. Just recently gone into a fourth edition in 1996. And I asked Kemper back in the late 70s, I said, Ed, do you think you're in the DSM-2? And he said, no, I don't. And I said, well, why not? He said, I read it. He said, I just don't think I'm in there. And I said, well, why is that? They know everything, don't they? And he said, oh, I don't think so, Mr. Ressler. I said, well, what do you think? He said, oh, they'll catch up to me, one of these days, people like me. I says, when? He says, oh, my problem will probably be somewhere in DSM 6 or 7. Well, in that statement, he's saying effectively that it'll probably be about 2025 or 2015 before the field of psychiatry catches up with his type of mental illness, his type of mental disorder. Jeffrey Dahmer the same way. If you think it's sane to drill holes in people's heads and turn them into sex zombies, if that's sane behavior, what are we talking about? But that's the way it went. Of course, Dahmer was killed in prison shortly after he was put back into the population. I think we're just about run our gamut here. And Dr. Moore, do you have any words to impart? Yeah.
Since Mr. Ressler is about wrapped up, we're going to have a little reception in the lobby right now, so you can, talk with Mr. Ressler on a more personal level and sign books. He'll be right out there in the front. Thanks for coming, and let's give it a hand.
Yeah, I won't say goodbye. I'll say see you out in the hall. So it's not goodbye yet. Okay. Thank you for coming. Thank you very much.